They released the hounds after midnight because cruelty prefers darkness. The hunters believed they were chasing one exhausted man through the Louisiana marsh. They had dogs, horses, guns, and the law on their side. But the man they called a fugitive had studied every patch of sinking ground, every black channel, every place where sound died in the reeds. By dawn, the question was no longer whether Ezekiel Freeman could escape. The question was why he wanted them to follow him in the first place. They said Ezekiel Freeman ran because he was afraid. That was the first lie. Fear was present that night. It moved through Belmorne Plantation like smoke through floorboards. It passed under doors, slipped into the quarters, settled inside the lungs of men and women who had learned to breathe quietly. But fear did not belong only to the people in bondage. By midnight, it had also entered the big house. Augustus Vail did not know it yet. He stood in his study with a glass of brandy in one hand and a riding crop in the other, pretending that order still lived inside his walls. The study smelled of ink, tobacco, polished wood, and old paper. On the desk, a lamp burned low beside a stack of receipts, letters, and false records that had made rich men richer and erased poor people from their own names. A drawer sat half open. The ledger was gone. For a moment, Augustus did not move. He stared at the empty space as if the book might return out of obedience. It had been kept there for years, bound in dark leather, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath ordinary plantation accounts. To an outsider, it would have looked like a record of shipments, debts, and property transfers. To the people whose lives had been broken by the names inside it, it was something else. It was evidence. Children sold under altered names, families divided after promises had been made, payments to officials, notes beside dates, initials of men who sat in courtrooms on Sundays and counted profits on Mondays. The ledger did not merely record cruelty, it recorded cooperation. Augustus Vail understood the danger of paper. He had trusted chains, dogs, riders, and silence. But a book could travel farther than a wounded man. A book could reach a newspaper office, a church, a judge not yet bought, a city where whispers turned into testimony. He turned toward the door. Who was in here? No one answered. The servants had learned the value of looking at the floor. The housewomen stood in the hallway with stiff shoulders and empty faces. Among them was Ruth Freeman, 29 years old, thin from work, her hands raw from lie, her eyes lowered with the precision of someone who had survived by hiding intelligence in plain sight. Augustus looked at each face. Ruth did not blink. Outside, the plantation was still. The cane fields lay dark under a low sky. The cabins formed a row of black shapes beyond the yard. Farther out, the cypress trees marked the beginning of the wet country, where land gave way to water and water pretended to be land. That was where Ezekiel Freeman had spent his life listening. He was 34, though men at Belmorne looked older than their years by design. His back had the permanent bend of field labor, but his eyes did not belong to a defeated man. They were patient, watchful, and difficult to read. He had been used for years as a marsh guide whenever Augustus needed timber marked, lost cattle found, or hidden paths cleared after storms. White men called that skill useful. They never called it knowledge. That mistake would matter. Ezekiel knew the marsh in a way no overseer could purchase. He knew which grass grew over water deep enough to swallow a mule. He knew which roots could hold a man and which ones only looked solid. He knew where sound traveled and where it vanished. He knew the smell of coming rain, the direction of hidden current, the thin tremble in the mud before it gave way. Most of all, he knew that men who believed themselves masters rarely looked down until the ground was already taking them. That night, in the slave quarters, 17 people waited without speaking. A baby had been wrapped tightly against his mother's chest to keep him from crying. 2 boys sat barefoot near the door, each holding a sack too small for a life and too heavy for a child. An old man named Josiah had tied strips of cloth around his knees, though everyone knew he could not walk fast. A girl of 13 clutched a tin cup because it had belonged to her mother. No one told her to leave it behind. They were not running toward a dream. They were running from a sale. At sunrise, a trader was expected from New Orleans. Augustus Vale had already marked names. Children would be separated first. Young women second. Men with scars last, if they could still work. This was how the system disguised its violence as business. It did not need rage to destroy a family. It needed only a list. Ruth had seen the list. She had also seen the ledger. For 6 months, she had cleaned Augustus's study and counted his habits. She knew when he drank. She knew when he locked the drawer. She knew where he hid the second key. She knew which floorboard creaked near the door and which one could bear her weight without sound. At 11 that night, while the big house slept under the false piece of money, Ruth removed the ledger and carried it under a stack of folded linens. She did not hurry. Hurrying was how people got noticed. Behind the kitchen, where the wall had cracked near the smokehouse, Ezekiel waited in shadow. Ruth passed the oilcloth bundle through the gap. Their hands touched for half a second. Neither spoke at first. Then Ruth whispered, "They'll know before morning." Ezekiel took the ledger and slipped it beneath his coat. "They need to know," he said. Her face tightened. That was the part no one else knew. The plan did not require secrecy until daylight. It required discovery at the right hour. Too early, and the plantation would be locked down. Too late, and the trader would arrive. But if Augustus found the ledger missing after midnight, he would do what men like him always did. He would send force in the direction he believed guilt had gone. Ezekiel looked past Ruth toward the quarters. "Get them to the wash path," he said. "Jonah knows the turn." Ruth's eyes flicked toward the dark fields. "He's 12. He sees what grown men step over." That was true. Jonah had no letters, no schooling, no right to speak in rooms where white men stood, but he knew the marsh signs better than most adults. He could tell a safe path by the tilt of reeds. He could identify shallow water by the insects above it. He had spent years watching because children in bondage were expected to be invisible. Invisibility had become his education. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter. "And you?" Ezekiel listened. From the big house came the first sound of disturbance. A door slammed. A man shouted, then another. "I'll take the dogs," he said. Ruth looked at him then fully. In the faint light, her face showed what discipline had been hiding, not panic, not weakness. Recognition. This was not a husband making a sacrifice without telling his wife. This was a strategy they had built together from grief. Years earlier, their first child had been chased to the edge of the marsh after being accused of stealing food. The boy had been 8. The dogs had found him before Ezekiel did. No grave marker stood for him. No record mentioned him. Augustus had called it an accident and deducted the value of lost labor from nobody because the dead child had never been allowed to possess value beyond use. That day, Ezekiel stopped fearing hounds. He began studying them. He learned how they trusted scent too deeply. He learned how handlers trusted hounds too blindly. He learned how a trail could be made louder than truth. Fish blood, torn cloth, sweat rubbed onto cane leaves, a boot print pressed where no man needed to step. The dog did not know intention. It knew only invitation, and Ezekiel had prepared one. The bell near the overseer's shed rang once, then again. The plantation woke with violence. Men stumbled from cabins. Women reached for children. A rider crossed the yard. Lanterns appeared near the stables. Somewhere, a whip cracked against a post, not flesh, but the message was clear. Augustus wanted obedience before explanation. Silas Pike arrived within the hour. He came from the North Road with 4 riders and 6 hounds, his coat buttoned high, his hat low, his expression bored by other people's terror. He was 41, narrow-faced, with pale eyes, and a mouth that rarely opened unless there was money involved. Men like Silas called themselves trackers. That word was too clean. He hunted human beings for payment and carried himself as if skill could wash the stain from the work. Augustus met him near the stables. "One man," Augustus said. "Ezekiel Freeman. He took something from my study." Silas glanced at the cabins. "Alone?" Augustus hesitated. That hesitation was the second crack in the night. "I want him found," he said. Silas heard what was not said: a missing book, a frightened planter, a reward likely larger than usual. He smiled without warmth. "Then loose the dogs." The hounds were brought forward on chains, ribs showing beneath short coats, noses wet, bodies trembling with trained hunger. They had been made into instruments. That did not absolve the men who used them. The plantation liked to pretend violence was natural when it could be assigned to animals, laws, markets, or necessity. But every chain had a hand behind it. A scrap of Ezekiel's shirt was given to the lead dog. The animal sniffed once, then pulled hard toward the cane. Silas looked pleased. "He's close." Augustus mounted his horse. "I'm coming." Silas did not object. Pride was useful in a client. It made him reckless and generous. Across the yard, Ruth stood with the other women. Her face remained blank as the riders passed. No one looked closely at her. No one noticed the absence of 17 people from the farthest cabins. No one counted the children because the system never counted them properly unless selling them. That blindness had been part of the plan. Ezekiel moved through the cane at a pace just fast enough to be believed. He did not run like a desperate man. Desperation wastes the body. He moved with control, breaking stalks where the moonlight could catch them, dragging one foot when he wanted the dogs certain, stepping onto hard ground when he wanted time. Twice he stopped to press the shirt scrap against low branches. Once he cut a fish open and smeared blood near a turn where the path divided. The hounds screamed into the night. Behind him men shouted, "He's cutting east." "No, the dogs have him south. Keep them moving." Ezekiel heard every word. Sound traveled strangely in the cane. It bounced, thinned, returned from the wrong direction. Men unfamiliar with darkness often filled it with noise. That was another weakness. At the edge of the fields he paused near a dead cypress. The first marker, a strip of cloth hung from a branch, nearly invisible unless one knew it was there. Beyond it lay two paths. The left path looked open, dry, and simple. The right path descended toward black water and a wall of reeds. Ezekiel went right, not immediately. He made sure to stumble first. He let his hand hit the mud. He left a print. He let the story write itself for the dogs. Then he disappeared into Black Heron Marsh. The name did not appear on plantation maps. Men like Augustus named land only when they could own, sell, drain, or tax it. The people forced to move through it had their own names. Black Heron was the place where the trees stood in water, like witnesses. It was where escaped men hid for hours beneath roots, while patrols passed above. It was where women buried items too dangerous to keep and too sacred to lose. It was where the dead sometimes remained unnamed but not forgotten. To the hunters, it was an obstacle. To Ezekiel, it was a courtroom. Silas reached the cypress minutes later. The hounds pulled toward the water path. One rider cursed, "He went into that?" Silas knelt and touched the mud. He lifted his fingers, smelled them, and looked into the reeds. "He's tired," he said. "Scared men choose bad ground." Augustus sat rigid on his horse. "Can we follow?" Silas stood. "With dogs? Yes." That was the third lie. The men entered the marsh believing pursuit still belonged to them. At first, the ground held. Mud sucked at boots, but released them. Water rose only to the ankles. The hounds moved fast, noses low, bodies straining forward. The riders stayed mounted for another 50 yards, then another. Branches scraped their coats. Mosquitoes gathered around lantern flames. The smell changed from cane and dust to rot, algae, and standing water. Ezekiel remained ahead, close enough to be heard once, never close enough to be seen clearly. A splash, a broken reed, a shadow between trunks. Silas pushed harder. The dogs lunged. That was the trap inside the trap. The trail was not merely leading them into the marsh, it was teaching them confidence. Every sign confirmed what they wanted to believe. Every print rewarded their arrogance. Every torn thread told them the hunted man was losing control. Meanwhile, the real escape moved west. Ruth led the group through a drainage ditch behind the quarters, where Jonah waded barefoot in water up to his shins. He held no lantern. Light was for people who did not know the path. "This way," he whispered. Josiah struggled first. 2 men lifted him under the arms. The baby stirred, but did not cry. Ruth carried the ledger beneath her dress, tied flat against her body with a strip of cloth. It pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Behind them, the hounds sounded farther east. That sound would have broken some people. For Ruth, it measured distance. Each bay meant the hunters were following Ezekiel. Each shout meant the yard was emptying of men. Each minute meant the ledger moved closer to the river. Jonah stopped near a patch of pale grass. "Not there," he said. One of the men, Isaac, frowned. "It looks dry." Jonah shook his head. "Too smooth." He stepped left, onto a ridge of roots, hidden beneath shallow water. The others followed. The girl with the tin cup slipped once, but Ruth caught her by the shoulder. No one spoke harshly. There was no room for blame among people carrying one another through darkness. Back in Black Heron, the hunters began to slow. The first horse refused. It planted its front legs and threw its head, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. The rider kicked its sides. The animal backed into another horse. A lantern swung wildly. Hot oil spilled into the water and vanished. Silas turned. "Dismount." No one liked the order. Men who hunt from horseback dislike meeting the ground. It makes them equal to what they pursue. But the trees were too close now, the mud too deep, the water too uncertain. One by one, the riders climbed down. Augustus was last. His boots entered the marsh with a sound he would remember if he survived the night. A low, wet pull, like the earth taking hold. "How much farther?" he demanded. Silas did not answer directly. "The dogs still have him." The lead hound dragged them forward. Ezekiel had doubled back once, crossed a narrow strip of water, then walked along a fallen tree to break his trail. But he had left enough scent beyond it to keep the dogs convinced. He had not confused them. Not yet. Confusion would come later, when they were too deep to retreat easily. He crouched behind a screen of reeds and watched them pass. Silas first, holding the lead chain. 2 riders behind him. Augustus in the middle, breathing hard, trying to hide it. The remaining men fanned out poorly, stepping where the dogs stepped, trusting paws more than ground. Ezekiel's face did not change. This was the part that required discipline. Hatred could ruin a plan as quickly as fear. He could not rush. He could not show himself too soon. He had to let the marsh do what men refused to imagine it could do. One hound stopped, its ears flattened. Silas jerked the chain. "Move!" The dog whined. That was the first honest sound of the chase. Not rage, not command, warning. Silas ignored it. The water deepened, knee-high, then higher. The mud changed texture beneath them. It no longer resisted in a simple way. It shifted. A man would step on what felt like ground, put weight on it and feel it loosen under him. Roots caught ankles, hidden holes opened between clumps of grass. The hounds began to lose their straight line, circling, pulling, returning to the same patch of water. Augustus looked around. The trees were all alike. The plantation had vanished. No house lights. No road, no field edge, only trunks, reeds, black water, and the pale steam of breath in damp air. "This is far enough," one rider said. Silas turned on him. "You want to tell Mr. Vale you lost his man?" The rider said nothing. That was how systems of cruelty maintained themselves, not only through belief, through embarrassment, through debt. Through men afraid to appear weak before other men. Pride drove them deeper than necessity would have. Ezekiel moved again. This time he let them see him, only for a second. A shape crossing between two cypress trees. A man's shoulder, a flash of white shirt. "There!" Augustus shouted. The hounds erupted. Silas released two from the shorter line, trusting them to close the distance. Ezekiel ran. Now he allowed speed. He crashed through reeds, splashed hard, broke branches. The released dogs came after him, their bodies low and powerful. Behind them, Silas cursed and pushed forward. The men followed because momentum had replaced judgment. The marsh narrowed into a channel where water lay dark and still. Ezekiel knew the crossing. 3 submerged roots formed a crooked bridge beneath the surface. Step right, then left, then long onto the mossed rise. Miss the second root, and the mud would take the leg to the thigh. He crossed without looking down. The dogs followed the scent line straight. The first made it halfway, then sank chest deep. The second collided with it, clawing at water, barking in panic. The sound cut through the marsh and came back broken. Silas reached the channel and froze. For the first time that night, his face changed. Not fear yet. Calculation. He scanned the water and found no visible path. Augustus pushed up behind him. "Get them out." Silas handed a line to one rider. "Go around." "There is no around." "Then find one." The rider stepped forward, testing the mud with his boot. It held for 1 step. On the second, it swallowed him past the knee. He grabbed a branch. The branch snapped. Another man caught his coat and pulled. The water turned cloudy around them. The dogs thrashed harder. Ezekiel stood on the far rise, hidden by shadow, watching the machine begin to break. He thought of his son, not as a picture. Pictures fade when there are no portraits. He remembered weight, the weight of a small body lifted from mud, the weight of a silence no father should be asked to carry. He remembered Ruth standing beside him, not crying, because crying had become another luxury stolen by exhaustion. The marsh had heard that silence. Now it heard something else. Men who had profited from terror were beginning to plead with the ground. "Pull him! The dog's caught!" "My leg! Hold the lantern higher! Don't step there!" No one commanded the marsh. No title mattered in water. No bill of sale made mud firm. No law passed in a courthouse could teach a fool where to place his foot. That was the moral fact Ezekiel had trusted. The lead hound, still on chain, began to back away. Its body trembled. Silas struck the water near it with the butt of his gun. "Forward!" The dog refused. Augustus saw it. His voice rose. "You said they had him." Silas's eyes moved toward the far bank. They did. Then he saw Ezekiel, not running now, standing. The distance was not great, but the marsh between them made it impossible. Ezekiel's shirt was torn. Mud streaked his face. In one hand he held a small oil lamp, its flame nearly gone. He looked less like a fugitive than a witness called at last. Augustus lifted his gun. The powder was damp. The shot failed. A small click entered the night and died there. Ezekiel did not flinch. For several seconds no one spoke. Even the trapped dogs had quieted to low, desperate sounds. The hunters stood in water that had climbed above their knees. Behind them, the way back had become uncertain. Ahead of them, the man they hunted watched from dry ground. Silas shouted across the channel, "Where is the road out?" Ezekiel's answer was quiet, but the marsh carried it. "You passed it an hour ago." The words did not sound triumphant. That made them worse. They sounded like a record being corrected. Augustus stepped forward in rage and sank to his thigh. 2 men grabbed him before he went deeper. His hat fell into the water and drifted away. For the first time in his life, perhaps, he reached for help and did not receive obedience quickly enough. Ezekiel turned away before the scene finished. He did not need to watch every consequence. The purpose of the night was not revenge alone. Revenge was too small for what had been taken. The purpose was removal, delay, exposure. Ruth still had to reach the river. The ledger still had to speak. He moved along the rise through a curtain of moss, following a path so narrow even moonlight seemed careful upon it. Behind him the hunters continued shouting. Ahead, somewhere beyond the black trees, 17 people were walking toward a world that might still reject them, hunt them, cheat them, and call their testimony inconvenient. But they were walking. That mattered. At bell morn the cabin stood open. The trader from New Orleans would arrive at sunrise expecting inventory. He would find absence. Augustus's study would still smell of tobacco and brandy, but the drawer would remain empty. The system would do what it always did when exposed: deny, minimize, threaten, and search for someone weaker to blame. But paper had left the plantation. So had memory. So had the people Augustus had planned to divide. And in the deep marsh, where the hunters believed they had cornered one man, the truth had turned around and cornered them. History often records escape as movement away from danger. That is incomplete. Sometimes escape is also an accusation. Sometimes survival is evidence. Sometimes the hunted do not vanish because they are lost. They vanish because they know exactly where they are going, and the men chasing them do not. If this story holds your attention, stay with it, because what happened in Black Heron Marsh was not just an escape through water and mud. It was the beginning of a reckoning that Belmorne Plantation had spent years trying to bury. Subscribe and follow the next part of this dark history, where Ruth carries the ledger toward the river, and the names inside it threaten to bring down men who thought no one would ever dare write the truth. By the time Ezekiel Freeman disappeared beyond the first black line of cypress trees, the men behind him believed the chase had entered its final stage. That was the fourth mistake. A pursuit is easiest to understand when it looks simple. One man runs. Other men follow. Dogs pull at chains. Horses strike wet ground. Lanterns swing. Commands cut through the dark. On paper, it appears orderly. In plantation records, it might have been described as recovery, enforcement, correction, but records written by violent men are rarely honest about the moment violence begins to fail. What happened inside Black Heron Marsh was not a chase. It was a transfer of control. Ezekiel had entered the swamp with no horse, no gun worth mentioning, no uniform, no legal protection, and no one behind him who could safely intervene. Silas Pike entered with paid riders, trained hounds, firearms, and the confidence of a man who had turned other people's terror into a profession. Yet only one of them understood where they were. The swamp did not announce itself all at once. It took the hunters gradually, as if allowing them time to confess their arrogance through each step. At first, the path seemed passable. The water lay shallow over packed mud. Tall reeds opened into narrow corridors. Cypress knees rose from the ground like blunt black teeth. The dogs kept their noses low and drove forward with savage certainty. Silas followed the lead hound with practiced focus. He trusted the animal more than any map. He had built his reputation on that trust. Men hired him because he could read a broken twig, a bent blade of grass, a faint print in sand. In another landscape, those skills had made him dangerous. In Black Heron, they made him predictable. Ezekiel had counted on that. Hours earlier, before the alarm bell rang, he had prepared the first false trail near the cane. He rubbed sweat into a strip of torn shirt and dragged it along a low branch at knee height. He stepped heavily where the soil would hold an impression. He broke stalks just enough for a man to see them by lantern. Then he cut east before doubling south. The path was not meant to hide him. It was meant to flatter the men hunting him. A false trail only works when the person following it wants to believe he is winning. Silas wanted that. Augustus Vale needed it. The riders behind them depended on it. Every mark told them the same story. The runaway was careless, frightened, weakening. He had left too many signs. He had chosen bad ground. He had made the mistake all desperate men make. That story was bait. The hounds swallowed it first, their bodies strained forward, ribs pumping, paws slapping mud. They did not know cruelty. They knew training. They knew scent, reward, correction, command. The men behind them had made them into instruments and then pretended the violence belonged to the animals. It did not. Every chain had a human hand at the end of it. Silas tightened his grip as the water rose above his boots. "He's cutting deeper," one rider said. "He's tiring," Silas answered. The rider looked toward the trees. "Or he knows this place." Silas turned his head just enough to make the warning feel like disobedience. "He knows how to run, that's all." That was how professional cruelty protected itself, by refusing to recognize intelligence in the people it hunted. The system could admit strength when it had to. It could admit endurance. It could admit usefulness, but it resisted admitting strategy. Strategy implied a mind implied personhood, and personhood was the one truth slavery had to deny every hour in order to continue. Ezekiel moved ahead of them in silence. He was not far. At times he could hear Silas breathing. He could hear Augustus cursing each time mud gripped his expensive boots. He could hear the riders pretending not to be afraid. The swamp compressed distance. A man hidden 20 yards away could seem lost forever. A man shouting 50 yards behind could sound close enough to touch. Ezekiel used that confusion carefully. He did not run in a straight line. A straight line belonged to panic. He moved from marker to marker, the split cypress, the fallen sweet gum, the cluster of white reeds that grew only where water covered root ridges. He stepped where the ground had memory of his weight. He avoided patches too smooth to trust. Twice he sank to one knee on purpose and pulled himself out slowly so the mud would take the shape of struggle. The hunters found those marks and believed them. Silas knelt beside one deep print and held up his lantern. He fell here. Augustus leaned forward, sweat shining at his temples despite the night air. How close? Close enough? That answer pleased Augustus because it required no thought. Rich men often prefer answers that confirm ownership over reality. Augustus had lived for years in a world arranged to obey him. Cane fields, account books, overseers, kitchen bells, auction notices, even Sundays. He had mistaken arrangement for truth. But the swamp was not his house. It did not care about his name. It accepted his weight exactly as it accepted anyone else's. Behind him, one of the horses began to tremble. Its hooves shifted in the mud. The rider tried to steady it, but the animal resisted the path. Horses are not moral creatures, but they can recognize danger more quickly than men corrupted by pride. "Leave the mounts tied," Silas ordered. Augustus snapped toward him. "We are not abandoning them. We can't ride through this. I paid for speed. And now you need quiet." The two men stared at each other in the lantern glow. For a brief second, their alliance showed its true form, not loyalty, transaction. Augustus paid. Silas performed. Both men understood power, but neither trusted the other beyond usefulness. Finally, Augustus dismounted. His boots entered the water with a thick, sucking sound. He looked down, offended. The riders followed. One tied the horses to a cluster of cypress roots. Another checked the powder in his pistol and tried to keep it dry beneath his coat. The dogs whined, impatient. Silas took the lead again. Ezekiel heard the change in rhythm. Men on foot made different mistakes. They watched their own feet too much. They lost sight of one another. They clustered near the easiest path, which was often the most dangerous because it had been made easy by water moving beneath the surface. They trusted anything that looked firm. They cursed when the ground contradicted them. The swamp was beginning its testimony. Far west of them, Ruth Freeman moved through a different kind of dark. There were no hounds near her now, but the danger had not lessened. It had only changed shape. She led 17 people through a drainage cut behind the lower field, where stagnant water reflected no moon. Jonah walked ahead, barefoot, stopping every few yards to feel the bottom with his toes. He carried a branch stripped of leaves. Not a weapon, a question. He pushed it into the mud before each turn. If the branch sank too easily, he shifted direction. If bubbles rose black and slow, he backed the group away. If reeds leaned inward, he avoided the center. The boy did not explain his reasoning. He had learned from watching, and watching does not always translate into words. Ruth trusted him anyway. That trust was one of the quiet crimes the plantation never expected. It assumed the enslaved could labor together but not plan together, suffer together but not organize, whisper together but not build a system of knowledge beneath the master's floorboards. It saw community as weakness because it did not understand that community was how people survived what had been designed to isolate them. The baby stirred against his mother's chest. The mother froze. Everyone stopped. From far away, the hounds bayed again. The child whimpered once, barely a sound. Ruth stepped close and placed a hand on the mother's shoulder. No command, no blame, only pressure, steady and human. The mother bent her head and breathed against the child's face until he quieted. Jonah looked back. Need to move. Ruth nodded. How far to the wash ridge? Less if nobody steps wrong. That was not comfort. It was accuracy. Ruth preferred it. She adjusted the ledger beneath her dress. The oilcloth had been tied tightly across her ribs, but with every step the corners pressed into skin. She welcomed the pain. It reminded her the book was still there. Men like Augustus believed pain belonged to other people. Ruth had turned it into inventory. Inside that ledger were names that had been protected by distance and handwriting. The planter who bought children under false ages, the sheriff who delayed warrants, the clerk who changed records after money crossed his desk, the judge who dismissed petitions because the petitioners had no recognized standing before the law that had already profited from their silence. The ledger was not justice. It was a blade that might cut open the lie. That distinction mattered. Evidence does not save anyone by itself. It must be carried, protected, believed. And even then, the powerful often survive truth by calling it disorder. Ruth knew this. She had no childish faith in paper. But she also knew that without paper, Augustus would be free to say nothing happened. That was the first shelter tyranny builds, denial. She intended to burn it down. Back in the marsh, Silas began to sense a problem but could not yet name it. The scent trail remained strong in places, then vanished where it should have continued. The dogs circled too often. Twice they pulled toward water that showed no sign of passage. Once the lead hound stopped at the base of a tree and barked upward, confused by cloth. Ezekiel had tied to a low branch after walking backward over exposed roots. Silas understood tricks. He had seen them before. Pepper, creek crossings, split paths, false shoes, men doubling back over stones. But this was different. The trail did not try to lose him. It kept inviting him forward. That should have warned him. Instead, it insulted him. Silas's jaw tightened. He yanked the dog away from the tree. Forward! The hound resisted. Forward! The animal obeyed because obedience had been beaten into it. The group moved into a stretch where the trees grew closer, their roots twisting above the water like dark hands. Lantern light caught Spanish moss and made it look like hanging cloth. The air grew still. Even the insects seemed to retreat. Augustus broke the silence. He cannot know all this in the dark. Silas did not answer. He was born on this place, Augustus continued, trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Raised here, worked here, nothing more. There it was again, the need to reduce knowledge into labor. If Ezekiel knew the land, Augustus wanted that knowledge to be an extension of plantation work, not independent intelligence. The master could tolerate skill only if he believed he owned it, but Ezekiel's knowledge had never belonged to Augustus. It had been gathered in stolen minutes, while carrying timber, while searching for lost cattle, while burying grief, while pretending not to listen, while watching water lines after storms, while memorizing where white men refused to go. The plantation had used his body. It had failed to notice his mind was keeping records too. The dog suddenly surged left. Silas followed. The ground sloped downward. Water rose to the men's knees. One rider cursed as something brushed his leg beneath the surface. "Keep moving," Silas said. The dogs pulled harder. Ezekiel had laid a strong mark there. Fish blood mixed with his own sweat smeared across reeds at dog height. The scent cut through rot and water. It promised certainty. The hunters followed it into a basin locals avoided after heavy rain. Ezekiel called it the Still Mouth. No map marked it. It looked like shallow water spread between cypress roots. Beneath the surface lay layers of soft mud and rotting vegetation that moved under pressure. It did not swallow quickly. That was what made it dangerous. It allowed a man to believe he could still turn around. Then it took his second step. Ezekiel waited on the far edge behind a raised bank. He could see the lanterns approaching in a broken line. He counted them, one ahead with Silas. 2 in the middle, one behind Augustus, another low, almost at water level, carried by a rider who had already slipped once. 6 hounds, 5 men besides Augustus. Too many to fight, not too many to mislead. He reached into his coat and removed the last strip of cloth. It had been tied beneath his arm long enough to carry his scent strongly. He wrapped it around a dead branch and tossed it across a narrow pocket of deeper mud toward a patch of reeds on the left. The sound was small. The lead hound heard it. The animal lunged. Silas moved with it. The line shifted left. That was all Ezekiel needed. A trap in such terrain did not require walls. It required momentum. It required men to commit their weight before understanding the cost. It required a handler to trust the dog, a dog to trust the scent, and a client to trust his paid hunter more than his own unease. All 3 occurred at once. The first rider sank to mid-thigh. He shouted, grabbed at the man beside him, and pulled him off balance. The second man stumbled, fell forward, and drove both hands into the muck. The lantern he carried hit the water and went black. Darkness widened. Silas spun around. "Hold position!" But the phrase belonged to dry ground. There was no position to hold. The mud shifted under every attempt to stand still. The hounds twisted in their chains, some trying to move forward, others back. Their bodies crossed the lines. One chain wrapped around a cypress knee. A dog yelped. Another snapped at the water. Augustus raised his pistol toward nothing. "Show yourself." His voice cracked against the trees and returned smaller. No one answered. That silence did more damage than a taunt. Men like Augustus expected fear to respond. They expected begging, panic, bargaining, some proof that their power still arranged the emotional world around them. Ezekiel denied him even that. Silas cut one chain loose to untangle the lead hound. It bolted toward the reeds where the scented cloth had fallen, made 3 desperate strides, then plunged chest-deep into soft mud. The animal thrashed. Water splashed black across its face. One rider moved to help it. Silas grabbed his sleeve. "Don't!" The rider stared at him. "It'll pull you in." The dog screamed. A trained instrument had become a living creature again, terrified and trapped by orders it never understood. The men listened. None moved. This is where the moral stain becomes impossible to hide. They had brought the dogs to spread fear through human quarters. They had trusted the panic of animals when it served them, but the moment the same terror demanded risk from them, they calculated distance. They weighed loss. They chose themselves. That was not survival. It was the logic of ownership turned inward. Augustus looked at Silas with disgust. "Get your dog." Silas did not move. "Get it," Augustus repeated. Silas's voice dropped. "You step there, you don't come back." For the first time, Augustus understood that his money could not command the ground. He turned away, furious not because the dog suffered, but because the scene exposed the limit of his authority. Another hound began pulling backward, then another. The pack no longer wanted the trail. This was the breaking point Ezekiel had been waiting for. Hounds trained to pursue could still recognize an environment where pursuit no longer made sense. Their handlers, trapped by pride and payment, were slower to learn. Silas tried to regroup. "We back out to the ridge." A rider pointed behind them. "Which ridge?" The lanterns turned. Every direction looked wrong. The path they had used had filled with disturbed water and broken reeds. Their own footsteps had collapsed the edges. The horses were out of sight. The cypress trunks repeated in every direction. The sound of the trapped dog made thinking harder. Mosquitoes gathered around their faces. Mud dragged at their boots with each movement. Augustus scanned the darkness. "He's close." Silas heard the accusation. "So is the way out if you let me work." "You lost control of your animals." Silas stepped closer. "And you lost control of your plantation." No one spoke after that. The sentence hung in the marsh like a charge formally entered, because it was true. At that same hour, Ruth's group reached the wash ridge. The ridge was not high ground by ordinary standards. It rose only a few feet above the flooded lowland, a narrow strip of firmer soil covered with tangled brush. But to those moving through water, it felt like a road. Jonah climbed first, then turned and helped the girl with the tin cup. Isaac and another man lifted Josiah. The old man bit down on his sleeve to keep from groaning. His legs shook so badly Ruth thought he might collapse before the river. "We rest here," Isaac whispered. "No," Ruth said. He looked at her. She did not raise her voice. "If they turn back now, they'll search west." "They won't turn back soon," Jonah said. Ruth looked at him. The boy's face was unreadable in the dark. "How do you know?" He pointed east. The hounds were no longer baying in rhythm. Their cries came broken, scattered, confused. They reached the bad water. No one asked how he knew. By then they had stopped doubting him. Ruth took one breath and moved again. The group followed the ridge toward a stand of dead trees. Beyond that lay a shallow crossing, then the old church road. If all went as planned, a wagon would be waiting near a burned chapel before dawn. The man driving it was not a savior. He was a printer's assistant from Baton Rouge, connected to people who opposed slavery and distrusted local courts. He had agreed to carry the ledger and whoever could fit beneath tarps of hay. Ruth did not know whether he would keep his word. Trust, in her world, was never clean. It was measured against risk, need, and the absence of better options. Still, she walked. Behind her, the plantation that had claimed her body for years grew smaller with every step. But escape did not erase what had happened there. That is another lie often told for comfort. Freedom does not undo the sale of a child. It does not restore names removed from records. It does not return years spent under command. The best it can do at first is stop the next theft. Ruth carried the ledger because stopping the next theft required more than reaching the river. It required accusation. In the Marsh Basin, accusation had taken another form. Ezekiel stepped into view, not fully, just enough. He stood on the far side of a dark channel where roots formed a narrow crossing known only to him. His face was streaked with mud. His shirt hung torn from one shoulder. He looked tired now because he was tired. Strategy did not make the body endless. Silas saw him first. "There!" Augustus turned, rage flooding his face with new energy. "Shoot him! One rider lifted his rifle. The powder flashed weakly and failed. Wet air, damp hands. Bad angle, poor care. The weapon clicked into humiliation. Ezekiel did not run. That stillness unsettled them more than flight. Silas narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" The question was revealing. He did not ask where Ezekiel was going. He did not ask what he had taken. He asked what he wanted, because somewhere beneath the professional hunter's pride, he had begun to understand that the night had intention. Ezekiel looked at the men, then at the trapped hound still struggling in the mud. "Turn back," he said. Augustus laughed once, harsh and breathless. "You hear that? He's giving orders now." Ezekiel's gaze shifted to him. "No," he said, "I'm telling you what the ground already told you." A rider crossed himself. Silas noticed. Fear spreads faster when men try to hide it. Augustus stepped forward, forgetting the mud. His right leg sank again. He grabbed Silas's shoulder to steady himself. Silas almost shoved him away, then remembered the money and did not. "You belong to Belle Morne," Augustus said. The old sentence. The rotten sentence. The sentence that had justified theft by repeating itself as law. Ezekiel's expression did not change. "Belle Morne is emptying." Augustus froze, not at the defiance, at the information. For the first time that night, he thought of the cabins, the trader, the missing ledger, Ruth's lowered eyes. The alarm that had drawn every armed man east. His face tightened. Silas saw it. What did he say? Augustus did not answer. There are moments when a powerful man realizes he has been outmaneuvered and tries to disguise the realization as anger. Augustus reached for that disguise immediately. He pointed at Ezekiel. "Take him!" No one moved. The order had no path to travel. Between the men and Ezekiel lay water, mud, roots, darkness, and the sudden knowledge that their target might not be the only thing missing. Silas turned to his riders. "We pull back." Augustus stared at him. "No. We pull back now, or we spend the night here." "I said no." Silas stepped closer, voice low. "And I'm saying your man led us into a sink." The word landed hard. A sink was not a place one charged through. It was a place that punished insistence. Everyone there knew it, though only Silas had said it aloud. Ezekiel used that moment to disappear again. Not dramatically. No shout. No final gesture. He stepped backward into reeds and was gone. Augustus lunged as if he could stop absence itself. "After him!" Silas did not follow. That refusal marked the true end of the chase. The hunters had not been defeated by one sudden disaster. They had been defeated by a sequence of denied warnings. The refusing horse, the confused dogs, the deepening water, the vanishing trail, the sinking rider, the wet powder, the empty plantation implied in Ezekiel's words. Each warning had offered them a chance to turn back with less loss. They had chosen pride every time. Now pride had no dry ground left. The work of retreat began. It was slower than pursuit and more honest. Men who had entered the marsh loudly now moved with caution. They tested each step. They argued in whispers. They pulled one another free and resented the debt. One hound had to be cut loose. Another limped badly. A rider lost a boot and walked the rest of the way half barefoot, cursing with each step. No one mentioned Ezekiel. No one mentioned Ruth, but Augustus did the arithmetic in his head again, and each time the answer worsened. If the cabins were empty, he had lost property. If the ledger was gone, he had lost protection. If Ruth had taken it, he had misread her for years. That last fact may have angered him most. Oppressors often survive by imagining the people they harm as simple. It comforts them. It permits them to sleep. It allows them to mistake forced silence for emptiness. Ruth's theft of the ledger violated that comfort. Ezekiel's trap destroyed it. By the time the men found the horses, the animals were wild-eyed and straining against their ties. One had broken loose. Another had injured its leg against a submerged root. The riders gathered what they could. Silas counted his dogs and did not say the number aloud. Augustus mounted with difficulty. His clothes were soaked. Mud clung to his coat. His face had lost its controlled plantation dignity and gained something rawer, not humility. Never that. Humiliation. The sky in the east had begun to pale. Dawn was coming, and with dawn, witnesses. That frightened him more than the marsh. Meanwhile, Ruth saw the first broken outline of the old chapel through the trees. Its roof had burned years earlier. Only part of the front wall remained, along with a crooked doorway leading into darkness. A wagon stood beyond it beneath a covering of moss and branches. One mule, 2 wheels patched with mismatched wood, a man beside it holding a hat in both hands. He looked younger than Ruth expected, white, thin, nervous, not heroic. Good, Ruth thought. Heroes talk too much. You have it, he whispered. Ruth did not answer until she was close enough to see his hands shaking. Who sent you? Reverend Alcott. Baton Rouge. That name could be repeated by anyone. The young man swallowed. He said the book must go north before it goes public. He said if the woman named Ruth came, I was to tell her the river remembers what the courthouse forgets. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. That was the phrase. She untied the cloth beneath her dress and removed the oilcloth bundle. The ledger came away damp with sweat, but unharmed. She held it for a moment before handing it over. Letting go felt dangerous. Keeping it felt worse. The young man took it with both hands, suddenly understanding that he was not holding a symbol. He was holding consequences. Isaac helped Josiah into the wagon. The mother with the baby climbed in next. The 2 boys crouched beneath hay. Jonah remained beside Ruth. Where's Zeke? He asked. Ruth looked east. The hounds had gone quiet. That silence was not reassurance, it was space. It meant the plan had reached the point where no one could control every outcome. He knows the second crossing, she said. Jonah studied her face as if deciding whether she believed it. She did, because belief was required now, not as comfort, but as discipline. In Black Heron Marsh, Ezekiel moved alone along the hidden ridge. He had heard the hunters begin retreating. That was enough. He did not celebrate. Celebration belonged to safety, and safety had not yet been earned. He still had to cross north, circle west, and reach the old chapel before the sun rose high enough to expose movement. His legs ached. Mud had filled one shoe. A cut along his forearm burned where swamp water touched it. Twice he paused to listen for pursuit. None came, but he knew Augustus would return to the plantation soon. And a cornered master was not less dangerous. He was more honest. That was the shape of the coming day. Not victory, exposure, not rescue, retaliation. The ledger had left Belle Morne, but Belle Morne would not collapse quietly. It would accuse the stolen of theft, the fleeing of crime, the witnesses of lying, the dead of never having existed. This is why the story matters. Because the violence did not end when one group reached a wagon. It did not end when the dogs failed. It did not end when a proud hunter lost his way in mud. Systems built on human bondage did not fall because they were ashamed. They fought hardest when named. And on that morning, for the first time in years, Belle Morne Plantation had been named from within. The men who believed they were chasing one runaway had been drawn away from the house, away from the cabins, away from the road, away from the ledger. Their strength had been used against them. Their dogs followed scent. Their pride followed dogs. Their employer followed pride. And all of them entered a place where the rules they trusted no longer applied. That was Ezekiel's real weapon. Not the swamp alone. Understanding. He understood the land. Ruth understood the house. Jonah understood the hidden path. The others understood silence, timing, and mutual dependence. No single act freed them. A network did. A community did. The plantation had spent years trying to separate them by labor, age, fear, and sale. That night they answered as one body. By the time Augustus Vale rode back toward Belmorne, covered in mud and stripped of certainty, the eastern sky was gray. He could already see the outline of the big house beyond the cane. No smoke rose from the kitchen. No workers moved toward the fields. No children stood near the water barrel. The yard was too still. Augustus pulled his horse to a stop. Silas rode behind him and said nothing. The front door of the big house hung open. The slave quarters stood in a row, doors ajar, interiors emptied of more than people. Blankets gone, cups gone, a small carved toy gone from a windowsill. These were not signs of panic. They were signs of departure, organized departure. Augustus dismounted slowly. For once there was no one waiting to take the reins. Inside the study, the drawer remained open. The empty space where the ledger had been looked larger in daylight. Augustus stared at it. He had sent the hunters after Ezekiel because he believed a man on the run was the greatest threat. He had been wrong. The greatest threat had walked out through his kitchen, carrying the truth beneath her dress, while his dog screamed at shadows in the marsh. And somewhere beyond the reach of Belmorne, Ruth Freeman was still moving west, with the ledger that could turn private suffering into public accusation. The chase had failed. The reckoning had begun. The first light over Belmorne plantation did not bring relief. It brought inventory. That was how Augustus Vale understood the world when fear did not interrupt him. Fields were inventory. Tools were inventory. Animals were inventory. People were inventory, though the word was too clean for what it concealed. The plantation survived by reducing living souls into columns, prices, ages, skills, defects, expected yields, and punishments avoided or applied. But on that morning, the columns refused to balance. 17 people were gone. The ledger was gone. Ezekiel Freeman was gone. And the hounds that had been sent to recover him had returned silent, injured, and unwilling to look toward the eastern marsh. Augustus stood in the yard with mud drying on his coat. His face had hardened into the expression men use when humiliation must be disguised as command. The workers who remained were brought from the quarters and lined up before the well. Some had known about the escape. Some had suspected. Some had known nothing except that the night had changed the air. No one spoke. Silas Pike stood near the stables, washing black mud from his hands with a bucket of clean water that would have been denied to others for less. He kept his eyes down. Not from shame, from calculation. The hunt had failed in a way that could damage his name, and men in his business feared reputational loss more than moral rot. Augustus turned on him. "You said you could track any man." Silas did not look up. "I tracked him. You lost him." "No," Silas said. "He took us where he wanted us." The sentence landed in the yard like a public insult. Augustus stepped closer. "Choose your words carefully." Silas finally looked at him. "I am." That was the problem now. The lie could not hold inside the men who had entered the marsh. They had seen too much. They had watched the trail turn from evidence into instruction. They had felt their boots sink into ground that punished every confident step. They had heard Ezekiel's voice from the dry bank, calm enough to make their fear seem childish. "You passed it an hour ago." Those words had followed them out. A man can survive failure. He can even survive fear. But to be guided into failure by someone he considered beneath him, that was a wound Augustus did not know how to dress. He turned away from Silas and faced the line of remaining workers. Who helped them? The question was useless because the truth was larger than a name. The plantation wanted a single culprit. Systems of domination always do. A single culprit can be punished. A network is harder to hang, harder to sell, harder to erase. Augustus wanted to believe the escape had depended on one betrayal, one stolen key, one dishonest servant, one runaway man. It had not. It had depended on years of listening. The cook who knew which evenings Augustus drank himself dull. The stable boy who knew when riders changed shifts. The old man who remembered a drainage ditch no longer used after a flood. The washerwoman who noticed Ruth hiding strips of cloth. Jonah who watched reeds and water better than any mapmaker. Ezekiel who converted the hunter's confidence into a path leading nowhere. The plantation had been studied from below. That was the accusation no owner could bear. A woman near the end of the line lowered her eyes. Augustus saw the movement and mistook it for guilt. "You," she did not answer. "What do you know?" "Nothing, sir." The reply was thin but not false in the way he meant. She did not know where Ruth had gone. She did not know whether Ezekiel had reached the chapel. She did not know if the ledger had crossed the river. She knew only that, for the first time in years, the morning bell had rung, and fewer people had obeyed it. Augustus stepped toward her. Before he could speak again, a rider appeared on the north road. The trader from New Orleans had arrived. His name was Mr. Calloway, though names in that trade mattered less than ledgers, receipts, and the ability to look at suffering without interruption. He came in a dark coat with 2 assistants and a wagon meant for human cargo. He expected a profitable morning. He found mud on the master, silence in the yard, and too many cabin doors hanging open. Calloway removed his gloves slowly. "Mr. Vale." Augustus did not answer at once. The trader looked toward the quarters. "Where are they?" It was a simple question. It exposed the entire ruin. Augustus turned his rage into posture. There was an incident. Calloway's eyes narrowed. An incident does not empty cabins. Silas watched from the stables. For a brief moment the entire machinery showed itself. The planter, the trader, the hunter. 3 men who pretended to operate separate businesses but belonged to the same moral economy. One raised profit from forced labor. One moved people through markets. One pursued those who tried to leave. Each depended on the others while pretending his own hands were cleaner. Now one broken night had placed them in the same yard, facing the same absence. Calloway lowered his voice. "I had buyers waiting." "I will handle it," Augustus said. "You lost the people I came to collect." Augustus stepped close enough that the assistants shifted uneasily. "I said I will handle it." But he had already failed to handle the most important thing. In his study, the missing ledger had created a danger none of the men wanted to name in public. Calloway did not yet know it was gone. Silas suspected it. Augustus could feel the knowledge pressing against his ribs like a concealed weapon. He dismissed the workers with a sharp gesture. No one moved until the overseer shouted. Then the line broke slowly, not with relief, but with caution. Those who remained at Belmorne understood something the powerful often forget. When a tyrant is exposed, he becomes less predictable, not less dangerous. Augustus entered the house with Calloway behind him. Silas followed without being invited. Inside, the study smelled wrong in daylight. No longer private, no longer secure. Papers lay across the desk where Augustus had searched through them at dawn. A drawer hung open. Mud from his own boots had dried on the floorboards. Calloway noticed the drawer. "What else is missing?" Augustus said nothing. Silas closed the door. The room became smaller. Calloway's expression changed. "What was in it?" "Accounts," Augustus said. The trader's face sharpened. "Which accounts?" "Mine." Silas gave a short, humorless laugh. Augustus turned on him. "Leave." Silas did not move. "I was hired to recover your man. I need to know what he took." "He took nothing that concerns you." "If he took paper with my name in it, it concerns me." The silence after that was an answer. Calloway set his gloves on the desk. carefully, as if the gesture gave him control. "You kept names?" Augustus's jaw tightened. "Everyone keeps names. Not in one book." There it was. Not remorse, not outrage, fear of documentation. Men who commit crimes in groups often tolerate cruelty more easily than records. They trust memory to fade, witnesses to be silenced, and bodies to disappear into work, distance, or soil. But handwriting has a different kind of stubbornness. It can outlive the room in which it was made. The missing ledger had turned private brutality into portable evidence. Calloway looked toward the window. Where would they take it? Augustus answered too quickly. "They won't get far." Silas stepped closer to the desk. "They already got farther than you think." Augustus lifted his hand as if to strike him, then stopped. The presence of Calloway changed the calculation. Violence between men of business required caution. Violence downward required none. That was the plantation's entire legal philosophy, reduced to one room. Silas said, "They had a second route. Freeman drew us east. The others went west." Calloway looked at Augustus. "How many others?" The planter did not answer. "How many?" 17. Calloway cursed under his breath. Silas continued. "The woman from the house, Ruth. She was not in the quarters." Augustus's face hardened. He had known it, but hearing her name from Silas made the truth more solid. Ruth, the quiet one, the careful one, the woman who entered his study with folded linens, poured water without spilling, listened without appearing to listen. He had believed her obedience was proof of emptiness. In reality, it had been camouflage. Oppression often mistakes restraint for consent. That mistake had cost him the ledger. Calloway moved to the window. "We need riders on the West Road." Silas shook his head. "Too late. You do not know that." "I know what kind of night they planned. They would not run west without transport." Calloway turned. "Then find the transport." Silas's expression remained flat. "You want to search in daylight across 3 roads, 2 river crossings, and swamp paths no white rider here understands? With men already spooked and dogs that won't re-enter the marsh?" Augustus slammed his hand on the desk. "They are property." The word filled the room with its usual lie. No one challenged it morally. That was not the kind of men they were. But even inside the logic of their own system, the word was beginning to fail. Property did not steal ledgers. Property did not coordinate diversions. Property did not study trails, manipulate hounds, and move witnesses under cover of a false chase. People did that. The law could deny it. The swamp had not. Far west of Belmorne, Ruth Freeman sat beneath a hay covering in the back of the wagon, her knees pressed against Jonah's shoulder and the ledger wrapped again in oilcloth beside her. The printer's assistant drove with both hands rigid on the reins. He had given his name as Thomas Avery, and Ruth had decided not to trust it too much. Names could be borrowed. Fear could be performed. Good intentions could collapse at the first checkpoint. The wagon moved along a narrow road between stands of pine and low wet ground. Every turn carried risk. Every open stretch felt like exposure. The others lay hidden beneath hay and sacking, breathing through cloth, trying not to cough. The baby had been given a strip of damp linen to suck. Josiah drifted in and out of pain. Ruth kept one hand on the ledger. Jonah whispered, "Will they follow?" "Yes." "When?" "As soon as they stop blaming one another." The boy seemed to consider that. "Then we still have time." Ruth looked at him. In another life, he would have been praised for intelligence. In this one, his mind had to hide inside usefulness. She felt a familiar anger rise, not hot, not loud, but precise. A system that feared literacy had still failed to prevent thinking. It had only forced thought to travel by other roads. The wagon slowed near a creek crossing. Thomas Avery lifted one hand behind him. "Quiet. Everyone went still. Ahead, 2 men stood near the bridge with horses tied beside them. Local patrol, not formal soldiers, not uniformed authority. Something more common and, in its own way, more dangerous. Ordinary men granted permission by the system to interfere, inspect, and accuse. Avery straightened his coat and drove forward. One man stepped into the road. "Morning," Avery nodded. "Morning. What you hauling?" "Feed and scrap iron." The man walked alongside the wagon. His eyes moved over the hay. "From where?" "Mill north of Patterson." "That's so." The second man came closer, chewing tobacco, one hand resting near his belt. Ruth felt Jonah tense beside her. She placed 2 fingers against his wrist. Still. The first patrolman pushed at the hay with a short stick. It came within inches of Josiah's face. No one breathed. Avery forced irritation into his voice. "You poke any deeper, you buy what you damage." The patrolman looked up. "Big talk for a boy." "Not talk. Invoice." The word worked because it belonged to commerce. Men who might ignore mercy often respected paperwork. Avery reached into his coat and produced folded receipts. Ruth could not see whether they were real. The patrolman took them slowly, pretending to read more than he likely could. His eyes moved over the page. He looked at the wagon again. Then the baby shifted beneath the sacking. A soft sound rose. Not a cry. Not yet. Ruth's hand closed around the ledger. The second patrolman heard something. "What was that?" Avery answered too quickly. "Piglet." The first man frowned. "You said feed and scrap." "And a piglet," Avery said. The lie sat badly. The second patrolman stepped toward the rear. Jonah moved before Ruth could stop him. Not upward, not visibly. He reached beneath the hay and pinched the baby's cloth bundle lightly, not to hurt him, but to startle him into a sharper, animal-like squeal. The sound that came out was strange, muffled, and brief. Avery spat to the side. "Mean little thing, been doing that all morning." The patrolman hesitated. The human mind hears what it has already been told to expect. That weakness had ruined hunters in the marsh. It helped Ruth now. The first patrolman tossed the receipts back. "Move on." Avery did not hurry. Hurrying would reveal gratitude. He clucked to the mule and rolled across the bridge. Only when the road curved out of sight did the wagon release its breath. Ruth looked at Jonah. The boy stared at the floorboards, ashamed without reason. She leaned close. "You did right." He did not answer. That is how children under terror are often trained, to feel guilty for surviving the methods forced upon them. The world harms them, then demands innocence remain untouched. Ruth had no use for that false purity. Survival required judgment. Jonah had judged correctly. The wagon continued west. Behind them, at bell morn, Augustus began assembling a second search, not a chase this time. A sweep. Men rode to neighboring farms. Messages were sent to crossings. Descriptions were given, most of them wrong. The missing were reduced again into lists. Height, age, scars, clothing, market value. Ruth was described as a house servant of quiet disposition, a phrase that proved how little they had seen. Ezekiel was described as dangerous, though he had harmed no one directly. That was the word used whenever an oppressed person became difficult to control. Dangerous, not because he carried violence, because he carried proof that the powerful could be outthought. Silas refused to take the dogs west immediately. Augustus confronted him near the stable yard. "You are still under hire, and my dogs are blown. I paid for results. You paid for a night hunt. You got one. I got failure." Silas stepped into the shade of the stable. "You got the result of following a man into ground he owned better than you did." Augustus's face darkened. "He owns nothing." Silas did not smile. "That belief is why you lost him. The accusation was accurate enough to be dangerous. Augustus moved closer. "Careful, Pike." "No. You be careful. That book reaches Baton Rouge, maybe New Orleans, and every man whose initials sit beside yours starts looking for someone to blame." Calloway, standing near the carriage, heard this and turned away. Not from ignorance, from confirmation. The network was already beginning to protect itself. That is the reflex of corrupt power. Before it seeks truth, it seeks distance. Before it admits wrongdoing, it identifies expendable partners. The ledger had not yet been opened in public, but already it was working. It made men imagine testimony. It made them review signatures. It made them fear each other. Augustus understood. For years, the ledger had given him leverage. If a sheriff hesitated, Augustus had a date. If a trader disputed payment, Augustus had a line entry. If a judge demanded discretion, Augustus had initials and amounts. He had kept the book as insurance against other guilty men. Now the insurance had become a weapon against him. He ordered riders west anyway. By noon, the roads around Belmorne had changed. Men who had ignored cries from the quarters for years suddenly claimed concern for law. They gathered at junctions. They questioned wagon drivers. They searched abandoned sheds. They invented urgency because property had moved without permission. They called it disorder because they could not call it liberation. Ezekiel watched some of this from a ditch north of the old chapel road. He had reached the area after sunrise, but did not approach the wagon directly. That had been agreed. If he was followed, he would draw pursuit again. If he was alone, he would wait for the crow call from Jonah. He lay in damp grass, one arm bandaged with cloth torn from his sleeve, listening to riders pass on the road above. 2 men, maybe 3. One horse limped. They spoke carelessly. Vales lost his mind. "Wouldn't you? 17 gone in one night." "He'll blame Pike. Book's what worries him." "What book?" "Don't know. Something from the study." Their voices faded. Ezekiel closed his eyes. Ruth had made it far enough for rumors to outrun facts. That was something. He waited another hour before moving. Hunger made his body feel hollow. Fatigue blurred the edges of sound. But he did not allow himself to hurry. The old chapel stood near an exposed section of road. Anyone watching from the tree line could see movement around it. He circled through low brush until he found the mark. 3 stones stacked beside a burned stump. Safe. He approached from the rear. The chapel was empty. For one cold moment, he thought he was too late. Then he heard it. A crow call. Badly done. Too high, too short. Jonah. Ezekiel turned toward a collapsed wall where brush covered a shallow storage pit once used for root vegetables. The branches shifted. Jonah's face appeared first, then Ruth's hand. She came out slowly, covered in dust and hay. For several seconds, neither she nor Ezekiel spoke. The world had not allowed them many public gestures of affection. Even private tenderness had been rationed by exhaustion, fear, and the constant possibility of being watched. Now they stood in the ruins of a burned chapel, with riders searching the roads and a stolen ledger already moving away from them, and still their first instinct was restraint. Ruth touched the cut on his arm. "You're bleeding. Not enough to matter. That is not your decision." There was the smallest break in her voice, not weakness. Evidence of what the night had cost. Ezekiel looked past her. The others? Hidden south. Avery took the ledger ahead with Josiah and the baby. The rest wait until dark. "You trusted him?" "I trusted the phrase." Ezekiel nodded. It was all they had. Jonah climbed out fully. They came through the bad water. Ezekiel looked at him. Yes, all of them. Enough. The boy's face showed no satisfaction. He had seen the swamp's danger too closely to celebrate anyone trapped by it, even enemies. That too mattered. Freedom did not require becoming what hunted you. Ruth noticed. "You did not put them there," she told him. Jonah looked away. "I showed the path. You showed us a way out. They chose theirs. The distinction was necessary. Oppression depends on confusing responsibility. It punishes escape as provocation. It treats resistance as the cause of violence rather than the answer to it. But the hunters had entered the marsh by choice, by contract, by command, by profit. The people fleeing had chosen life. Those choices were not equal. Near Belmorne, Augustus began making the opposite argument before witnesses. By afternoon, he claimed the escape had endangered the entire parish. He claimed Ezekiel had set traps. He claimed Ruth had stolen private business records. He claimed outside agitators were involved, because admitting internal intelligence would be too humiliating. He sent a statement to the local magistrate and another to a neighboring planter whose initials appeared in the missing book. The language was careful. The panic was not. Silas left before sunset. Augustus tried to stop him, saying, "You walk away now. You won't be hired in this parish again." Silas tightened the strap on his saddle. "If that book names me, I need to be elsewhere before men decide who takes the fall." "You coward!" Silas looked down at him from the saddle. "I followed your runaway into a marsh and watched your empire empty behind your back. Call me what you want." Then he rode north. The departure mattered, not because Silas was innocent. He was not. But because his leaving showed the first fracture in the circle of men who had protected one another. The ledger had not yet reached print, yet already loyalty was becoming liability. At dusk, Ruth and Ezekiel moved the remaining escapees from the chapel ruins. They traveled in smaller groups now, 3 at a time. Then 4. Jonah led the first group to a creek bed where footprints would blur. Ruth took the second along a fence line. Ezekiel stayed behind with Isaac and 2 others to watch for riders. The plan was no longer elegant. Plans rarely remain elegant after first contact with daylight. It became practical, fragmented, tense. Hide here, move there, wait for the owl call. Do not cross open ground. Do not answer if called by name. If separated, follow water west until the second bridge. Darkness came slowly. Every sound seemed official. A branch breaking became a horse. A bird lifting became a signal. A distant shout became capture. The people moving through that evening did not move like fugitives in an adventure tale. They moved like people carrying the weight of every person who had tried before them and failed. Hope was present, but it did not make them light. It made them disciplined. That is a truth often softened in retellings. Hope under terror is not a song. It is a set jaw. It is a hand over a child's mouth, not to silence life, but to protect it. It is an old man continuing after his knees shake. It is a woman walking with evidence strapped beneath her clothes, knowing truth can still be intercepted by men with better horses. Ruth reached the second creek after dark. Avery was not there. For several minutes, no one spoke. Isaac scanned the road. He left. Ruth listened. Water moved under the bridge. Crickets pulsed in the grass. Farther off, one dog barked from a farmyard, then stopped. "No," she said. "He changed the point." "How do you know?" "Because if he had betrayed us, riders would be here." That was not faith. It was deduction. Jonah crouched near the mud. He found wheel marks half covered with cut grass. "Wagon went south." Ezekiel looked at Ruth. "Trap?" "Maybe." They did not have time for certainty. They followed the wheel marks off the road and into a pecan grove. 50 yards in, a low whistle sounded. Isaac raised a stick. Ezekiel stepped forward first. Avery emerged from behind a tree with both hands visible. "Road was watched," he whispered. "Had to move." "Where is the ledger?" Ruth asked. "Gone ahead." "With who?" "Reverend's man. Older, gray beard, scar here." Avery touched his chin. He knew the second phrase. Ruth's shoulders lowered by a fraction. The book was no longer with them. That made them safer. It also made the story harder to control. Once truth leaves the hands of witnesses, it enters a world of printers, editors, allies, cowards, opportunists, and men who prefer peace without justice. Ruth knew the ledger could be hidden, dismissed, bargained over, or used by powerful men against one another without freeing anyone else. But she also knew one thing had changed permanently. Augustus Vail no longer possessed the only written version of what he had done. That mattered. Avery led them to a second wagon concealed under branches. It could not carry everyone. No wagon could. The weakest would ride first. Josiah, the mother, the baby, the youngest children. The others would walk until midnight, then trade places if the road cleared. Ezekiel refused a place. Ruth expected that. Jonah tried to refuse, too. Ruth did not allow it. You ride. I can walk. You can also lead tomorrow if you are alive enough to think. The boy climbed in without another word. Before the wagon moved, Ruth turned toward Ezekiel. You know he'll come after us. Yes. Not for all of us. For you. Ezekiel looked east, where the road disappeared into darkness. Let him. Ruth's face hardened. No more bait. He met her eyes. No more bait. The promise was quiet, and like all promises made under pursuit, uncertain. But it was real. The wagon began moving. Ezekiel walked beside it for the first stretch, one hand on the wooden side rail. Ruth walked on the other side. Between them, hidden under hay, Jonah watched the stars through a gap in the boards. Behind them, Belmorn Plantation settled into a night unlike the one before. Its fields still stood. Its house still rose white against the dark. Its bells still hung. Its remaining workers still faced danger. No single escape ended the institution that had produced the crime. That must be said plainly. A story of survival should not be mistaken for a story of complete justice, but something had been broken, not the whole system. The illusion that the enslaved did not know, the illusion that silence meant loyalty, the illusion that dogs and riders could answer every act of resistance, the illusion that the master's records would always remain in the master's drawer. By the end of that day, Augustus Vail had men on the roads, but no certainty. He had money, but no trust. He had rage, but no ledger. He had a plantation, but fewer people to command. Most damaging of all, he had seen Ezekiel Freeman standing on dry ground across black water, not pleading, not running, not defeated. That image would stay with him, not because it threatened his body, because it corrected the story he had told himself about power, and by midnight, somewhere beyond the parish line, the ledger of Belmorn was moving toward a press that could make private crimes public. The swamp had taken the hunter's confidence. Ruth had taken the evidence. Ezekiel had taken their certainty, and the road west, dangerous as it was, now carried something Belmorn had spent years trying to destroy, witnesses who still remembered their names. The road west did not become safer after midnight. It only became less visible. That difference mattered. Darkness had protected Ruth Freeman and the others when the plantation first emptied. But darkness also belonged to patrols, informers, frightened farmers, and men who believed every moving shadow might threaten their property. The same night that hid the hunted could also conceal the next hand reaching for them. The wagon moved slowly beneath a low canopy of pecan and pine. Its wheels had been wrapped in strips of cloth to soften the sound. The mule labored without complaint, head low, ribs shifting under its hide. Beneath the hay, the children lay pressed between sacks, breathing in dust and fear. Josiah's knees had swollen badly. The mother held her baby against her chest so tightly that Ruth had to touch her wrist and remind her to let the child breathe. No one in that wagon mistook movement for freedom. Freedom was still ahead, uncertain and fragile. For now, they had distance. They had a stolen ledger moving by another route. They had a guide boy who read mud better than most men read print. They had Ezekiel walking beside them with a cut arm, a tired body, and the cold focus of a man who knew the first trap had worked, but the second danger had begun. The first danger had been pursuit. The second was panic. A plantation owner who loses people is angry. A plantation owner who loses records is afraid. A plantation owner who loses both becomes willing to burn down evidence, witnesses, and allies alike. By then, Augustus Vail was no longer trying to preserve order, he was trying to preserve himself. And those are different kinds of violence. At Bell Morn, lamps still burned in the big house long after the quarters had gone quiet. Augustus had not changed clothes. Mud had dried along the hem of his coat and cracked at the knees of his trousers. He stood over his desk with every drawer open, as if some overlooked scrap might replace what had been taken. It could not. The ledger had been more than an account book. It had been a private map of guilt. Names, sums, routes, dates, initials, payments marked as fees. Children entered under false ages, adults transferred under invented debts. Officers thanked in numbers rather than words. It was not the whole system. No single book could hold that much evil. But it was enough to prove that Bell Morn had not acted alone. That was why Augustus feared it. Not because the suffering inside the book was new. The suffering had always been there. It had cried in cabins. It had bled in fields. It had disappeared down roads south and east and west. Men like Augustus feared truth only when truth became portable enough to reach someone who might use it against them. Calloway sat across from him, hat on his knee, his face drawn tight. "You should have burned it years ago," he said. Augustus looked up. "You signed 3 pages. I signed what you told me was safe. You profited. So did you." There it was again, not remorse, but division. When guilt is shared, loyalty lasts only until exposure becomes likely. Then every man begins measuring the distance between his own name and the crime. Calloway leaned forward. "If that book reaches a press, I deny everything." Augustus laughed once. "Your handwriting denies with you? It can be called forgery. By whom? By every man named in it who wants to remain alive in business." The statement was ugly because it was plausible. Power does not simply lie. It organizes lies into agreement. It gathers signatures, witnesses, paid experts, friendly judges, frightened clerks. It makes denial look official. Augustus knew this. He had relied on it for years, but the ledger would still force the men named inside it to react. That reaction alone could damage them. The first crack in a conspiracy is not always confession. Sometimes it is the sudden movement of guilty men trying to stand apart from one another. Silas Pike was gone. That worried Augustus more than he admitted. A hunter running from the parish before dawn was a message. It told anyone watching that the night had gone wrong. It told them the swamp had not merely delayed pursuit. It had broken confidence. Silas was no moral witness, but he was a practical one. He had seen Augustus lose command. He had seen Ezekiel outthink him. He had seen the Hounds fail. Men like Silas sold services, but they also sold stories when useful. Augustus turned toward the door. "Send for Sheriff Bell." Calloway's eyes narrowed. "He is in the ledger. That is why he will come." The sheriff arrived before sunrise, broad-shouldered, red-faced, and already angry at being summoned into another man's emergency. He wore authority the way some men wear a borrowed coat, loudly, to distract from poor fit. His badge caught the lamp glow when he entered the study. "What happened?" he demanded. Augustus closed the door. For once he did not speak from above. He spoke like a partner in danger. "The book is gone." Sheriff Bell's face changed before he could control it. "What book?" Augustus stared at him. The sheriff understood the insult and the warning. Calloway stood by the window, watching. Bell lowered his voice. "Who took it?" "Ruth Freeman." "A woman?" Augustus did not answer. Bell glanced toward Calloway, then back. And Ezekiel drew the hunters east, into the marsh. The sheriff cursed softly. Even he understood what that meant. A false chase, a planned removal of armed men, a coordinated escape. This was not the simple disorder he preferred to manage with warrants and ropes of law. This was strategy. That made it more dangerous to men who depended on the myth of helplessness. Bell placed both hands on the desk. We block the crossings, we search houses, we stop wagons. Already started, Augustus said. Then we search churches. Calloway looked away. That was not an accidental suggestion. In that region, churches were often among the few places where messages could move beneath a moral vocabulary the authorities could not fully police. Sermons, funerals, charity wagons, hymnals, letters tucked into Bibles. Faith did not make every man brave or every congregation clean. But it gave some people a language beyond ownership. Sheriff Bell disliked any language he could not arrest. Augustus said, "There is a printer in Baton Rouge." Bell's jaw worked. Name? Alcott is connected. The sheriff nodded slowly. Then we do not chase the group. We chase the paper. That was the first competent thing anyone in that house had said since midnight, and it proved the fugitives had understood the conflict better than their pursuers. Ruth had not carried the ledger because it was sentimental. She had carried it because the people might be hunted individually, but evidence could move faster through hands, wagons, churches, and fear. The book was now the center of the battlefield. Far from Bell Morn, that same truth had already shaped the escape. The ledger was no longer in Ruth's possession. Avery had passed it to a gray-bearded rider near a burned mill, a man called Mr. Amon, who carried saddlebags filled with church pamphlets, receipts, and flower samples. The ledger had been divided before dawn, not physically torn apart, but copied in fragments from memory by those who had seen key pages, names repeated under breath, dates assigned to witnesses. Ruth herself had memorized 6 entries from the pages she had cleaned around for years. Jonah knew the symbol Augustus used beside children marked for private sale. Josiah remembered 2 names from the list because one belonged to the man who sold his daughter. That was the hidden strength of the plan. The book mattered. But the truth had already begun leaving the book. A system that tries to reduce people to property forgets that memory cannot be locked in a drawer forever. It can be punished, it can be frightened, it can be forced into silence. But under enough pressure it becomes method. It becomes code. It becomes a woman remembering dates while scrubbing floors. It becomes an old man preserving names because names are all he has left to give. It becomes a child noticing marks beside entries no one expected him to understand. The wagon halted before dawn near a low creek bordered by willow. Ezekiel raised one hand. Everyone froze. Ahead on the road, a lantern moved, then another. Avery whispered, "Patrol!" Ruth slipped from the wagon without a sound. Ezekiel caught her arm. "Stay with the others. They are not looking for the others first." He knew she was right. The sheriff would search for the ledger. The description would include Ruth. House servant, 29, dark dress, scar near left wrist from kitchen burn, quiet disposition. That phrase again, carrying its ignorance like perfume. Ruth removed her shawl and handed it to the mother in the wagon. "Put this over your head." The woman stared. "They'll think you're me." "No, they will look and move on if they think they have found nothing hidden." The mother's eyes widened. "And you?" Ruth looked toward the creek. "I know how to stand still." Ezekiel understood before the others did. He had seen her do it in the big house for years. Ruth could become part of a room, part of a wall, part of the work expected of her. Invisibility had been forced on her. Now she used it with intention. Jonah climbed down. "I'll go with her." "No," Ruth said. "You'll need the mud line." "No." The boy did not move. Ezekiel spoke quietly. "Jonah, The boy looked at him. "Go under the wagon. If they search, bite your hand before you make a sound." Jonah obeyed because the order treated him as responsible, not small. Ruth stepped into the creek and moved downstream through knee-deep water, bending under branches until she reached a cluster of willow roots. She lowered herself behind them, face just above the water, one hand gripping a root slick with moss. The wagon rolled forward. Avery straightened his coat and changed his face into irritation. Two mounted men stopped him at the bend. One carried a lantern. The other held a pistol pointed downward, not because he intended restraint, but because casual threat was part of the costume. "Roads closed," the lantern man said. "On whose order?" "Sheriff Bell." Avery sighed like a man inconvenienced by other men's importance. "I have flour bound for St. Martin." "Not now." The man walked around the wagon. "What's beneath the hay?" "Same as last time." "Feed, scrap, and a mean piglet." The patrolman did not smile. He stabbed into the hay with a stick. The children lay rigid beneath it. The stick struck wood first, then sackcloth. Then nothing. Jonah bit the side of his hand hard enough to taste blood. The patrolman moved to the back and lifted the edge of the covering. The mother sat there with Ruth's shawl pulled low, baby against her chest, eyes down. The lantern man stepped closer. "You!" She did not look up. "What's your name?" Avery cut in. "She doesn't talk much." The patrolman ignored him. "Look at me." Slowly, the woman raised her face. She was younger than Ruth, rounder in the cheeks, eyes wider with fear. In that moment, fear helped her. The patrol expected guilt. They did not expect calculation. They saw a frightened woman and believed they were seeing all of her. "That ain't the one," the second man said. "You sure?" Description said thin, scar on the wrist. The lantern man grabbed her left hand. No scar. He dropped it. The baby began to stir. The patrolman stepped back. "Move!" Avery gathered the reins. No one breathed until the wagon turned the bend. From the creek, Ruth watched the lanterns remain on the road. She waited until the sound of wheels faded. Then she waited longer. Patience is not passive when discovery means capture. It is labor. It is discipline under pressure. Only when the patrol began riding east did she release the route and move. She emerged from the creek soaked to the waist, teeth clenched from cold. Ezekiel appeared from the brush before she reached the bank. He had not stayed with the wagon. She knew he would not. "You said no more bait," she whispered. "I was watching. That is another word for bait." He did not argue. They moved parallel to the road until they found the wagon hidden behind a stand of cedar. The others had not gone far. Avery looked shaken now. His performance had cost him. Ruth climbed in and took back the shawl. The mother looked at her. "I thought he'd see." "He saw what he expected," Ruth said. That was the night's repeated lesson. Men trained by supremacy were often blind in predictable ways. They saw categories before people, roles before minds, property before community, fear before strategy. Their blindness did not make them harmless. It made them arrogant, and arrogance, when understood, could be used. By late morning, the first copy of a ledger page reached Reverend Alcott. He was not in Baton Rouge when the fugitives expected. He had moved after hearing that Sheriff Bell was questioning church roots. The page came to him through Amen, folded inside a hymnal with a cracked spine. Alcott was 60, narrow, tired, with ink stains on 2 fingers and a left eye clouded from an old injury. He had helped people before. He had also failed people before. That knowledge had stripped him of heroic language. He unfolded the page at a kitchen table in a widow's house. The room went silent. There were 7 names on that copied sheet. 2 traders, 1 sheriff, 1 clerk, 1 planter across the river, Augustus Vale, Callaway. Beside each name, amounts. Beside the amounts, dates. Beside 3 dates, the initials of children transferred under false descriptions. Alcott read the page twice. Then he said the only honest thing. This will not be enough. Eamon's face tightened. It names them. It names them to people who will deny it. We need the book. We need witnesses. We need one man inside that network to fear the others more than he fears us. That was cold. It was also true. Moral outrage alone does not defeat organized corruption. It exposes the soul of the witness, but not always the crime of the accused. The men named in the ledger had courts, newspapers, creditors, cousins, and guns. To move against them required more than truth. It required pressure applied at the weak seam. Alcott tapped Calloway's name. This one, Eamon frowned. The traitor? He will run from blame if made to think Vale means to place it on him. How do we make him think that? Alcott folded the copied page. We do not make him think. We let him read what Vale is already planning. That information had come from a source still inside Belmorne. A young stable hand named Micah, not part of the escape because his mother had been too ill to move, had listened under the study window after dawn. He heard Augustus and Sheriff Bell discuss which names could be sacrificed if the ledger surfaced. Calloway's name had been spoken first. Micah could not write, but he remembered. By afternoon, a message reached Calloway on the road east. Not a threat, a warning. Vale will give your name before his. Calloway read it twice beneath a live oak while his assistants pretended not to watch. Then he folded it, placed it in his coat, and looked back toward Belmorne. A guilty man does not need much proof to suspect betrayal. He already knows betrayal is reasonable because he has considered it himself. That is the weakness of conspiracies built on profit. They imitate loyalty while conditions are favorable. Once risk enters the room, every partner becomes possible evidence. Calloway changed direction before sunset. He did not ride to help Ruth. He did not ride to confess out of conscience. He rode to protect himself. History is full of such men. They are not redeemers. They are cracks. Sometimes justice enters through cracks. At the same time, Augustus tightened the net. Sheriff Bell's riders reached the old chapel after the fugitives had left. They found wagon tracks, trampled brush, and a strip of cloth from Josiah's knee wrapping. Bell held it between 2 fingers as if disgusted by the evidence of pain. They were here. One deputy spat. How far? Bell looked west. Far enough to make fools of us if we keep chasing blind. He ordered the chapel searched. Nothing. He ordered the storage pit opened. Empty. Then he saw 3 stones stacked beside the burned stump. A marker. He kicked them apart. It was a useless act, but men who arrive too late often punish symbols. At dusk, Ezekiel led the group through a stretch of low pine where the ground finally became firmer. The swamp smell faded. That should have comforted them. It did not. The marsh had been dangerous, but it had also hidden them. Roads belonged to men who claimed authority. Open land turned bodies into targets. Ruth walked near the center now, no longer leading from the front. She watched everyone. The girl with the tin cup had begun to stumble from exhaustion. Isaac carried her for half a mile. Josiah rode in the wagon, feverish and angry at his own weakness. Jonah moved between Ezekiel and Ruth, still studying ground, still silent. The boy had changed since the night before. Not into a man. That phrase is used too easily, often to excuse what adults have forced children to endure. Jonah remained 12. Tired, hungry, afraid, but others now looked to him before stepping. His knowledge had become visible, and visibility carried weight. Ezekiel noticed him looking east. Thinking about the bad water? Jonah nodded. They might have died. Maybe. Because of the path. Because they followed. The boy swallowed. I wanted them stopped. So did I. That wrong? Ezekiel took time before answering. It is wrong that they made stopping them necessary. Jonah looked at him. That ain't the same. No, Ezekiel said, it ain't. This was the moral line the story must not blur. The violence began long before the Marsh. It began in the ownership claim, the sale list, the hounds, the locked drawer, the threatened families. Resistance did not create the crime. It interrupted it. Night fell colder than expected. Avery guided them to a barn owned by a free black cooper named Daniel Reese, whose name had been kept out of every written plan for his protection. The barn smelled of hay, old wood, and rain. For the first time since leaving Belmorne, the group stood under a roof without being counted by an overseer. No one relaxed at once. Safety felt suspicious. Daniel Reese closed the barn door and barred it from inside. You have until moonset, he said. Then you move again. Ruth nodded. News? He looked at her carefully. The ledger page reached Alcott. The book is still moving. Bell searches west. Vale says Ezekiel murdered dogs and set traps. Ezekiel gave no reaction. Ruth asked, Calloway? Daniel's mouth tightened. Gone quiet. That mattered. Quiet men with guilty names could be more useful than loud allies. The group settled into corners. The children ate first. Then the women, then the men. That order had not been announced. It simply happened because hunger, when shared by decent people, becomes a form of moral accounting. Ruth sat beside Ezekiel near a stack of barrels. For a few minutes, they listened to others eat. Then she said, They know the paper is west. Yes. They will stop chasing us and chase it. Maybe they can do both. Ezekiel looked toward Jonah, asleep sitting upright, head against a post. Then we split again. Ruth knew it before he finished. No. Ruth. No. If the ledger draws them north, people go south. And you? I make them believe I still have it. She stared at him in the dark. No more bait. This is not the same. It is exactly the same. His voice remained low. If they catch the group, they drag everyone back. If they catch me, they still have questions. They will not ask gently. No. The truth sat between them. This was not martyrdom. Ezekiel did not want to be taken. He did not seek suffering to prove courage. He was making a calculation inside a world that gave him no clean choices. That is one of slavery's less visible crimes. It forced impossible decisions, then judged the victims for whichever pain followed. Ruth leaned closer. You think your life weighs less because you can lead them away. He looked at her then. She had struck the hidden place. That is not what I think. That is what you keep doing. For a moment, the documentary record must allow silence, not because there is nothing to say, but because some truths arrive too bluntly for speech. Ruth had carried the ledger. Ezekiel had carried pursuit. Each had risked death. But sacrifice can become habit in people trained to believe survival must be purchased with pieces of themselves. Ruth refused to let that habit go unnamed. Before Ezekiel could answer, Daniel Reese entered from the side door. Riders on the south road, he whispered. The barn changed instantly. Food disappeared into bags. Children were lifted. The mother covered the baby. Isaac moved to the rear door. Avery reached for the reins. Daniel held up a hand. Not patrol, one rider, coming fast. Ezekiel stood. Ruth stood with him. Hooves approached, slowed, then stopped outside the barn. A voice called softly, Reese. Daniel did not answer. The voice came again. I did not come for them. Daniel moved to a crack in the wood. His face shifted. Calloway. Inside the barn, everyone went still. The trader stood outside in the moonlight, hat gone, coat dusty, one hand raised to show he held no weapon. That did not make him safe. It only made him aware of how unsafe he was. Daniel opened the door a few inches. What do you want? Calloway's eyes moved toward the darkness behind him. Veil means to place the book on me if it surfaces. No one spoke. Ruth stepped forward from the shadows. Calloway saw her and understood at once who she was. For the first time in the story, one of the men named in the ledger faced someone whose life had been treated as a line entry inside it. He did not apologize. That would have been too easy. Instead, he said, "I know where Bell will search at dawn." Ruth's voice was flat. "Why tell us?" "Because if Bell finds the book, Veil controls the story. If Alcott prints it with my name alone, Veil controls the story. I can give roots, buyers, dates not in the book." There it was, self-interest wearing the shape of testimony. Ruth studied him. "You expect mercy?" Calloway swallowed. "No." "Good." Ezekiel stepped beside her. "What do you want in exchange?" Calloway looked at the floor. "Time to leave the parish." Daniel gave a bitter laugh. "That is all?" Calloway's face tightened. "And my name printed with the rest, not alone." That was the most honest thing he had said. He did not want justice. He wanted shared blame. Ruth understood the value. A guilty man willing to divide guilt could become useful evidence. Not noble, not forgiven, useful. She asked, "Where will Bell search?" Calloway answered quickly. "The North Ferry, the Mill Road, Alcott's first church. He thinks the book is moving by clergy." It is. He also sent 2 men toward Reese's place. Daniel's face hardened. "When?" "Before I left. They will be here before dawn." The barn had to empty again. No rest, no safety, no illusion that kindness from one guilty man changed the danger. Ruth looked at Ezekiel, not pleading now, deciding. "We do not split you off alone," she said. He held her gaze. "No." She turned to the group. "We move in 3 lines. Families stay with Avery, Jonah with me. Ezekiel takes Isaac and doubles back only far enough to leave sign east. Not his body, sign, cloth, prints, anything. Then he returns." Ezekiel did not argue. That mattered too. A plan built by many minds was stronger than one man's sacrifice. Calloway gave the roots. Daniel marked them in dirt with a broken stick. Jonah corrected one crossing without looking proud. Avery listened. Isaac repeated the sequence twice. Ruth assigned people by strength, speed, and fear. She did not ask who was brave. Bravery was not the issue. Usefulness was. Before they left, Ruth faced Calloway one last time. "If you lie, they may catch us." He said nothing. "But if you lie, the book still moves. And men who fear that book will come for you too." Calloway lowered his eyes. That was the only language he fully understood. Consequence. The barn emptied under moonlight. Behind them, Daniel Reese scattered hay over footprints and wiped the dirt map away with his boot. He would deny everything by morning, if forced. Not because he lacked courage, but because survival sometimes requires denying the work one has just done. The moral burden of that should rest not on him, but on the society that made truth so costly. The fugitives moved again. No singing, no speeches, no triumphant music for an audience eager to feel uplifted before the danger had passed. Just feet on cold ground, breath held at every road, children carried when they could no longer walk, names whispered so no one disappeared in the dark. East of them, Augustus Vail prepared his own version of events. By candlelight, he wrote a statement accusing Ezekiel Freeman of theft, violence, conspiracy, and destruction of property. He described Ruth as manipulated. He described himself as victim. This is what power often does when exposed. It steals even the language of injury. But beyond his reach, the true statement was already forming, not in one hand, in many. A ledger page with Alcott. A memory with Ruth, a root with Jonah, a warning from Micah, a reluctant testimony from Calloway, a failed chase witnessed by Silas. 17 living bodies moving west, each one contradicting the plantation's claim of ownership, simply by continuing to breathe outside its command. The net was tightening, but so was the evidence, and as the first gray edge of dawn approached, the men searching for the book did not yet understand the most dangerous fact of all. The truth was no longer in one place. By dawn, the search for the ledger had become larger than the search for the people. That was the first sign that Belmorne Plantation was losing control of its own story. Augustus Vail still told himself he was hunting fugitives. Sheriff Bell still called it a matter of law. Calloway still pretended his late-night betrayal had been a practical adjustment, not fear dressed as strategy. But beneath every order, every rider sent down a road, every question forced on a farmer or a preacher, the truth had changed shape. They were not chasing bodies anymore. They were chasing evidence. And evidence moves differently from flesh. A person must sleep. A person must eat. A child cries. An old man limps. A mother weakens under the weight of a baby. A man with a cut arm leaves blood on leaves if he is careless. People can be tracked, cornered, threatened, priced, and named in false notices. But evidence can be copied. Evidence can be memorized. Evidence can be folded into a hymnal, hidden beneath flour, carried by a rider who does not know the whole route, repeated by a child who cannot read but remembers marks, spoken by an old man who has nothing left to lose but the names of those already taken from him. That was what Augustus had failed to understand. He believed the ledger was a single object. Ruth Freeman had made it a contagion. The first riders sent from Belmorne reached Daniel Reese's barn just after sunrise. They found the doors open, the hay disturbed, and the air still warm with the presence of people who had left not long before. One rider kicked through the straw and found a strip of cloth. Another searched the loft. Sheriff Bell walked the floor slowly, reading absence with the resentment of a man who had arrived after the truth had moved on. Daniel Reese stood outside with both hands visible. He had prepared his face before they arrived, not innocent. Innocence invites argument, not frightened. Fear invites pressure. He chose irritation, the expression of a working man whose morning had been interrupted by men who believed badges and guns could replace intelligence. Bell stepped toward him. "You had visitors." Daniel looked at the barn. "I have barrels." "You had runaways." "I had rain coming through the roof." Bell struck him across the face. Daniel staggered, then steadied himself. He did not raise a hand. That restraint should not be mistaken for submission. It was calculation. The law in that yard had already chosen its side. Any gesture could become a charge. Bell leaned close. "Where did they go?" Daniel wiped blood from his mouth. "Who?" The second blow came harder. The riders watched. This is how systems recruit ordinary men into cruelty. They ask them not merely to obey, but to witness without objection. Each silent witness becomes slightly implicated. Each implicated man becomes easier to control. By the end, no one has to believe in the violence. They only have to stand near it and do nothing. Bell searched Daniel's face and found no root there, so he turned to the ground. Hoof marks, wheel tracks, too many directions. Someone had dragged brush behind the wagon for 20 yards before lifting it. Someone else had walked backward near the creek bed. The fugitives had left Sign east and gone south, then split again. The confusion was not perfect, but it was enough to cost time. And time was now the only wealth Ruth's people possessed. South of the barn, Ezekiel Freeman moved through pine shadow with Isaac and 2 younger men. Their task was not to escape fastest. It was to create noise in the wrong direction. They tore cloth on branches. They pressed false prints into wet soil. Ezekiel cut his own bandage and tied a blood-marked strip to a low bush near an eastern trail, then circled back over stones. Isaac watched him. You keep leaving pieces of yourself behind." Ezekiel did not stop. "Better cloth than bodies." "That ain't what I mean." Ezekiel looked at him then. Isaac's face was drawn from exhaustion, but his eyes were clear. "Ruth is right," Isaac said. "You keep making yourself the road." For a moment the only sound was wind in the pine needles. Ezekiel turned back to the trail. "Then make sure the road leads somewhere." The answer was not denial. It was the language of a man who had lived too long under conditions where personal survival and collective survival were made to compete. That was another crime rarely written down, forcing people to measure their own lives against the chance of saving others, then calling the cost courage. Isaac said nothing more. He followed. Farther south, Ruth led the main group along a shallow creek, where water erased footprints almost as quickly as they formed. Jonah walked ahead, carrying Daniel Reese's broken stick. He no longer looked like a boy merely helping adults. He looked like someone bearing a kind of knowledge that had become too visible to ignore. That visibility frightened Ruth. A child seen as useful by friends could become a target for enemies. The system that dismissed Jonah yesterday might mark him dangerous tomorrow. Intelligence in a black child was tolerated only when it served labor. When it served freedom, it became a threat. Jonah stopped near a bend. Not the creek anymore. Ruth crouched beside him. "Why?" He pointed to a line of foam caught against reeds. "Water's moving wrong. There's a drop ahead." "Rocks. Wagon can't pass." Avery, still driving the mule, looked over his shoulder. "There's no other way." Jonah pointed east of the bank. "Old pig path." Avery stared at the brush. "I don't see a path." "You're not supposed to." Ruth stood. "We take it." No one argued. That was new. The night before, some had followed Jonah because Ruth ordered it. Now they followed because he had been right too many times. The boy stepped into the brush and found a narrow passage half covered by vines. The wagon could not enter fully, so they unloaded the weakest first. Josiah leaned on Isaac's cousin when he returned from the false trail. The mother carried the baby. The girl with the tin cup walked with one hand on Ruth's skirt. The mule had to be led without the wagon for a stretch. Avery resisted leaving it. "That wagon is cover. It is also a sign," Ruth said. He looked back at the creek. She was right. Wheels told stories. Sometimes too clearly. They stripped what they could carry: water, cloth, a small sack of cornmeal, 2 blankets, a tin cup, a dull knife, 1 lantern without oil, and a coil of rope. Everything else stayed beneath the trees. Avery removed the mule's harness and slapped the animal lightly toward the creek road. "Where will it go?" Jonah asked. "Somewhere men will follow." The mule wandered west, dragging enough trace of the wagon to give Bell's riders another lie to believe. The group entered the pig path, single file. Branches scratched their faces, mud gripped their ankles. No one spoke above a whisper. The path was not long, but it forced them into a rhythm of complete dependence. One person bent a branch and held it. The next passed. Someone lifted the children over a root. Someone steadied Josiah. Someone covered the baby's mouth when a crow burst from the brush. Freedom in that hour was not an idea. It was logistics, a hand, a warning. A lifted foot, a swallowed cough, a decision not to leave the slowest person behind. By mid-morning, Sheriff Bell found the abandoned wagon. He smiled too soon. Men who want easy answers often confuse discovery with progress. The wagon sat near the creek road, one wheel sunk slightly in soft ground, hay scattered, cloth hanging from the rear board. The mule tracks continued west. Bell followed them for nearly half a mile before the tracks widened, crossed through muddy water, and dissolved among cattle prints near a farm lane. One deputy removed his hat. "They split." Bell turned on him. "Of course they split." But his anger revealed the opposite. He had hoped for a single trail, A single trail meant control. Multiple trails meant minds working against him, and he disliked invisible minds most of all. Then a rider approached from the north with news. A ledger page had appeared in Baton Rouge, not the full book, one page, copied by hand. Delivered to a newspaper office and a church committee within the same hour. It did not accuse Belmorne directly in public yet. It did something more dangerous. It asked questions with dates attached. What happened on March 14, 1856? Why was payment made to Sheriff B the following week? Why were 3 children listed under new ages before transport? Why did Augustus Vail's account mark the matter settled? Questions can be sharper than declarations when guilty men already know the answers. Bell read the copied sheet and folded it slowly. Who has seen this? The writer hesitated. Enough. That word struck harder than a number. Enough. Enough to prevent quiet destruction. Enough to make denial complicated. Enough to force every man named to begin protecting himself. Enough to move the story beyond Belmorne's fences. Bell looked east toward the plantation. Augustus would not like this, but Bell no longer cared only what Augustus liked. His own initial had been written on that sheet. A single letter, but placed beside a payment and a date. He could claim coincidence. He could claim forgery. He could claim political agitation, clerical error, malicious gossip. He could do all of it, but he could not pretend the problem belonged only to Augustus Vail. The ledger had crossed the line between private sin and public risk. That changed loyalty into strategy. At Belmorne, Augustus received the news from Calloway himself. The traitor had returned by noon, not as ally, not as friend, but as a man who wanted a seat at the table before blame was distributed without him. He found Augustus in the study with 2 neighboring planters and a clerk from the parish office. All 3 stopped speaking when he entered. Calloway noticed. Guilty men always hear silence as evidence. Augustus stood. You should be on the road. I was. Then why are you here? Calloway placed a folded notice on the desk. Because your book is already speaking. The clerk snatched it first, read it, and went pale. One planter cursed, the other walked to the window. Augustus read without moving his lips. His face became still in a way that made the room more dangerous. Forgery, he said. No one answered quickly enough. He looked up. I said it is forgery, the clerk swallowed. Then we say so. Who is we? That was Calloway. The question was quiet. Everyone turned. Calloway did not sit. He kept his hat in one hand, his other hand near his coat pocket, where a pistol might have been or might not. His courage was not moral. It was cornered. If this becomes a case, he said, each man will say the page is false, until someone offers a name to save himself. I will not be the name. Augustus's eyes narrowed. You threaten me in my house? I remind you that your handwriting is in that ledger more than mine. The clerk stepped back from the desk. There it was, the fracture made visible. The book had not yet appeared in full, and already the men who built the system together were preparing separate exits. They had believed the ledger was a tool of mutual protection. It had become a mirror, and each man saw another coward looking back. Augustus lowered the paper. Find Ruth Freeman. No one missed the shift. Not find the book. Find Ruth. Because Ruth had become the living bridge between the stolen ledger and the stolen lives behind it. Paper could be called false. A woman who had cleaned the study, seen the drawer, memorized names, carried the book and escaped with others could not be dismissed as easily if she reached the right listeners. That made her dangerous, and it revealed what the powerful fear most, not accusation alone, but accusation from someone they tried to make invisible. By afternoon, Ruth's group reached the edge of a settlement hidden beyond a line of cane and pine. It was not a town in the formal sense. No sign marked it, no official map admitted it. A few cabins, a cooper's shed, a smokehouse, a small burial ground, and a prayer house with no bell. Free black families lived there with caution sharpened by necessity. Some had papers, some had relatives still enslaved, some had changed names more than once. All understood that legality was not the same as safety. An older woman named Mariah Bell, not related to the sheriff and quick to say so, met them near the tree line. She looked at Ruth first. "You the one from Bell Morn?" "Yes." "You bring trouble?" "Yes," Mariah nodded. Good, trouble was coming anyway. That was not welcome in the soft sense, it was recognition. Communities like hers survived by telling the truth quickly. Sentiment wasted time, denial killed people. The fugitives were divided among cabins, children first. Josiah was laid on a table while a woman washed his swollen knees. The mother and baby were taken to a back room with quilts hung over the windows. Avery was given water, but not trust. Ezekiel stood near the door until Mariah ordered him to sit. "You bleeding on my floor." He sat. Ruth did not. She asked, "Where is the ledger?" Mariah looked at her for a long moment. "Not here." "Where?" "Moving." "With who?" "People who know not to tell me." Ruth accepted that. Compartmentalization had become protection. No one carried the whole story now. That was how the story survived. Mariah handed Ruth a cup. "Drink." Ruth did, and only then realized how thirsty she was. Jonah stood in the doorway, staring toward the burial ground. Mariah followed his gaze. "That boy yours?" "No." "Looks like he belongs to the road." Ruth looked at him. "He belongs to himself." Mariah gave a short nod. "That is the first hard lesson." Inside the settlement for 2 hours, the fugitives became people again in small, practical ways. Feet washed, cuts bound. Food divided, names exchanged. Not all names were real, that was understood. A child slept with bread still in her hand. Isaac leaned against a wall and wept silently, not from despair, but because his body had finally found a place where it could stop pretending. Ezekiel sat while an old man stitched his forearm. The needle went in and out. "You led them into Black Heron?" the old man asked. "Yes." "Hunters?" "Yes." "Dogs?" "Yes." The old man tied the thread. "Good." Ezekiel looked at him. The old man did not smile, not because they suffered, because they learned the world has places that will not serve them. That was the clearest sermon spoken that day. Outside, Ruth stood with Jonah near the burial ground. Wooden markers leaned in rows, many without full names, some marked only with initials, some with carved symbols, a small bird, a crescent, a hand, a cross. Memory had survived where paperwork had refused it. Jonah pointed to one marker shaped with 3 lines. "What does that mean?" Mariah, standing behind them, answered. "Child taken before she was named in church records. Her mother marked 3 lines because she lived 3 days. Jonah looked down. "Do they know her name?" "Her mother did." "Is that enough?" Mariah's voice hardened softly. "It had to be, but no, child. It was never enough." Ruth closed her eyes. That was why the ledger mattered. Not because paper was sacred, because stolen people had been denied records, except when records served sale, labor, punishment, or debt. To write a name truthfully inside a hostile world was an act of defiance. To preserve a name was to deny the thief's final victory. A writer arrived before sunset, not with panic, with urgency. Alcott had the full ledger. For a moment, Ruth did not move. The words seemed too large to enter the air. The full ledger. Eamon had delivered it to a safe press outside Baton Rouge after changing horses twice and passing through a German printer's shop that owed Alcott a favor from years before. Copies of the most dangerous pages were already being made. One had gone to a northern paper, one to a church committee, one to a lawyer known for taking cases others called impossible. Another, by Alcott's instruction, had been sealed and hidden where no single raid could recover it. Ruth listened without expression until the writer finished. Then she asked, "Did he read the page with the children?" The writer nodded. "All of it?" Yes, her face did not soften. Good. That single word carried more grief than celebration. The truth had survived the first pursuit. Now the next question began. What would people do with it? Because exposure is not justice by itself. It is only the door being forced open. Many will stand outside that door and complain about the noise. Some will say the timing is inconvenient. Some will ask whether the document is authentic while ignoring the living witnesses. Some will demand calm from the injured and patience from the hunted. Some will pity the guilty for losing reputation before they pity the victims for losing families. The narrator must say plainly, such reactions are not neutrality. They are protection for the powerful. At Belmorne, the powerful were already protecting themselves. By evening, Sheriff Bell returned with riders, but no fugitives. Augustus met him in the yard. "You failed." Bell dismounted slowly. "You lost them before I was called. You let them pass. You kept a book with my mark in it." The yard went still. The remaining workers heard the words. So did Calloway. So did the clerk. So did two riders who would repeat it later for their own reasons. Augustus stepped closer. "Careful." Bell's hand moved near his pistol. "No, you be careful. If I fall, I do not fall alone." That was the collapse beginning, not noble confession, not justice yet. Mutual threat, the guilty turning on one another because the hidden record had made silence expensive. Calloway stood near the porch, watching the planter and sheriff measure betrayal in the open air. He looked older than he had the day before. The clerk whispered, "What do we do?" No one answered. For years, Belmorne had survived because everyone knew his role. Master, trader, sheriff, clerk. Hunter, overseer, worker, servant, child. Each role enforced by law, money, violence, and habit. Now the roles were shifting. The sheriff was exposed. The trader was frightened. The clerk was implicated. The master was vulnerable. The servant had become witness. The guide had become strategist. The child had become mapmaker. And the people marked for sale had become a moving testimony that no record could fully control. That night, Ruth finally slept for 1 hour, not deeply, not safely, but under a roof where no overseer opened the door. 1 hour was an act of recovery. When she woke, Ezekiel was sitting beside the wall, awake. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No." "Because of writers?" "Because of tomorrow." She sat up. "What happens tomorrow?" "They decide whether to print names." Ruth looked toward the dark window. "They have to. They may fear the backlash. Then they are not allies." Ezekiel did not disagree. Ruth stood and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. "I will speak if they need a witness." He looked at her. "That puts you in sight." "I have been in sight all my life. They just refused to see me." There was no arguing with that. By morning, 2 men from Alcott's circle arrived at the settlement. One was the lawyer. The other was a printer with ink under his nails and fear behind his eyes. They asked Ruth to recount the theft of the ledger, the drawer, the key, the entries she remembered, the sale list for Sunrise, the names of those missing, and the route out. They asked carefully at first, then too carefully. Ruth noticed. "You want the truth softened." The lawyer paused. "We want it believed." "By whom?" "People with power to act." "And what do those people prefer? That I was confused? That I misunderstood numbers? That I took a book I could not read?" The printer looked down. Ruth leaned forward. "I cleaned that study for 6 years. I saw who came in. I saw who left with envelopes. I saw the ledger opened after traders visited. I saw the mark beside children's names. I carried the book out because the men who wrote in it believed no one in that house had eyes." The lawyer said nothing. Ruth's voice stayed calm. Do not make me smaller so they can believe me." That sentence should have been printed above the ledger itself. Too often, testimony from the oppressed is accepted only after being reduced to fit the comfort of the listener. Less anger, less certainty, less accusation, less memory, but a truth made polite for guilty ears is already half buried. The lawyer closed his notebook. "We will print the names." The printer exhaled. Ruth looked at him. "All of them." He nodded. "All that can be verified." Ruth held his gaze until the phrase changed. "All of them," he said. The issue appeared 2 days later. Not everywhere, not in every paper, not with universal courage. But enough. The Belmorn ledger was named. Augustus Vale was named. Sheriff Bell was named. Calloway was named. The clerk was named. 2 neighboring planters were named. Dates were printed. Payments were printed. Descriptions of children altered for sale were printed. Testimony from Ruth Freeman was summarized. Statements from unnamed witnesses were included. The failed Marsh pursuit was reported not as legend, but as a fact of the escape. Armed men and hounds drawn away from the plantation, while witnesses and records left by another route. The story moved faster than riders. By the time Augustus held a copy, his hands shook with controlled fury. He stood in the study where the ledger had once been hidden and read his own name in public ink. The room did not protect him anymore. The desk did not protect him. The drawer was just wood. The house was just a house. He threw the paper into the fire. That act accomplished nothing. Another copy had already crossed the river. Another sat in a church. Another was being read aloud by men who pretended outrage and women who understood exactly what they were hearing. A truth printed once can be burned. A truth printed widely becomes weather. Sheriff Bell resigned before he was removed, claiming illness. Calloway gave a statement through counsel, not to cleanse himself, but to drag others with him. The clerk disappeared for 3 days, then returned with records he said had been altered under instruction. Silas Pike denied all knowledge of the ledger, but admitted the Marsh chase had failed because Ezekiel Freeman used the ground against us. That phrase traveled, used the ground against us. It was meant as accusation. It became tribute. Augustus Vale was not struck down by a single dramatic blow. History rarely grants such clean endings. He fought. He denied. He hired counsel. He called Ruth a thief, Ezekiel a criminal, Alcott a fanatic, Calloway a liar, Bell unreliable, the ledger forged, the witnesses coached. He did what exposed power always does. He attacked the mirror, but the mirror had multiplied. Belmorn never returned to what it had been. Buyers hesitated. Creditors grew cautious. Partners distanced themselves. The traders' network fractured under suspicion. Families who had feared speaking began sending names quietly to Alcott's circle. Not all were saved. Not all cases were heard. Not all guilty men paid the cost they owed. That must be said. A true story does not pretend one ledger destroyed an entire system overnight, but it did destroy the silence around one plantation. And silence had been one of the system's strongest walls. Months later, in a settlement farther north, Jonah stood beside a rough table where a map had been drawn in charcoal. Not a formal map with property lines and owner names, a living map, creek beds, safe barns, hostile crossings, roads to avoid, churches that could be trusted only after dark, marsh paths marked not with measurements but with signs. White reeds, split cypress, 3 stones, bad water, firm root. Ezekiel watched him correct a line. "Path bends here," Jonah said. The adult beside him frowned. "Look straight from the road." Jonah tapped the charcoal. "Road lies." No one laughed. They had learned. Ruth sat near the door, reading slowly from a printed copy of the article. She had begun learning letters from the very words that had once been used to record other people's suffering. That fact carries its own indictment. A world that denied her reading had still depended on her accuracy. A world that called her property had still been forced to answer her testimony. Ezekiel stepped outside before sunset. The land there was not Black Heron Marsh. The air smelled different. The trees stood farther apart. But when wind moved through the grass, he still heard water under reeds. He still heard hounds. He still heard his own voice carried across the channel. "You passed it an hour ago." People repeated that line later as if it were the whole victory. It was not. The victory was not only that hunters entered the wrong ground. The victory was that Ruth carried the ledger, that Jonah found the path, that Isaac questioned sacrifice, that Daniel Reese opened a barn and then denied it with blood on his mouth, that Mariah Bell took fugitives in and called trouble by its proper name, that a frightened printer printed anyway, that witnesses who had been treated as objects became a record no master could fully erase. The marsh mattered because it reversed the chase. The ledger mattered because it reversed the accusation. But the people mattered most because they reversed the lie. The lie said they were voiceless. They spoke. The lie said they were helpless. They planned. The lie said they were property. They remembered their names and carried them beyond the fence. And that is why Belle Morne feared them, not because they vanished, because they returned as testimony. Years later, some would turn the story into a legend about one man and a swamp. They would speak of Ezekiel Freeman as if he alone defeated the Hounds. They would say he knew secret paths, that he made dogs lose their minds, that he stepped on water where others sank. Those versions were easier to tell. They were also incomplete. Ezekiel himself rejected them. When asked how he escaped, he did not begin with the marsh. He began with Ruth. When asked how the hunters lost the trail, he did not begin with himself. He named Jonah. When asked why Augustus fell, he did not say because one man ran. He said because many people stopped helping the lie stand upright. That is the part worth remembering. A system built on bondage does not survive by force alone. It survives by records, habits, silence, false language, paid cooperation, and the daily training of people to look away. To oppose it, one must do more than flee. One must expose, preserve, testify, carry one another. Refuse the story written by the oppressor. The deep marsh was never merely a hiding place. It was the place where the hunters discovered they were not the only ones who knew how to use pursuit. It was the place where dominance became disorientation. It was the place where men who believed themselves masters met ground that did not recognize them. But the final lesson did not belong to the mud. It belonged to the people who crossed it. They understood that survival is not passive. It is a discipline. It is memory under threat. It is strategy born in places where open resistance is punished. It is the courage to move when staying means being divided, sold, silenced, or erased. At the edge of that history stands a boy with a charcoal map, a woman with a printed testimony, and a man who once led hounds into water so others could carry truth to dry ground. The hunters thought the marsh swallowed the trail. They were wrong. The marsh preserved it, and if this story has held you to the end, do not leave it as a tale of one impossible escape. Remember what it exposes. Cruelty can command dogs, roads, courts, and ledgers for a time, but it cannot command every memory, every witness, every hidden path, or every person it tried to make invisible. Subscribe and stay with these stories, because buried history does not rise by accident. It rises when we keep listening, keep naming the guilty, and refuse to let silence do the work of the oppressor.